channel?
I'm not sure how someone could characterize something as an irregular channel when you're talking to the President of the United States, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, the Chief of Staff of the White House, the Secretary of Energy. I don't know how that's irregular. If a bunch of folks that are not in that channel are aggrieved for some reason for not being included, I don't know how they can consider us to be the irregular channel and they to be the regular channel when it's the leadership that makes the decisions.
And so the concerns, raised were never brought to a head.
Well, they were never raised.
Okay.
They were never raised. No one said, back off of Ukraine, this is dangerous, you're doing something that's untoward, we have concerns, there was a bad phone call on July 25th, there's talk about a drug cocktail or something. No one ever said that to me by phone, by text, by email. I don't remember anybody sounding any alarm bell because, of course, had someone mentioned it, I would have sat up and taken notice. Everyone's hair was on fire, but no one decided to talk to us.
When you talk in your statement about in the absence of any credible explanation for the suspension of aid, I later came to believe, it was your speculation, it was your guess, that the resumption of security aid would not occur until there was a public statement from Ukraine committing to the investigations of 2016. And I believe you said that at this point, you believed everyone knew this. Is that correct?
I think once that Politico article broke, it started making the rounds that, if you can't get a White House meeting without the statement, what makes you think you're going to get a $400 million check? Again, that was my presumption.
Okay. But you had no evidence to prove that, correct?
That's correct.
You stated that you haven't been able to access your records. Is that correct?
Not all of them. And there are lots of notes, records, readouts of calls. Can't get to them.
But you've also stated that you don't take notes, right?
I don't take notes, but there are a lot of others out there.
And you freely admit that when last I asked at your deposition, we put together a list of all the times you said you don't recall. It's like 2 pages long.
Is that all?
So, you don't, on a lot of these questions, there's nuance, there are ambiguities, and we don't have records, we don't have notes, and we don't have recollections, correct?
Right. It's situational things that sort of trigger memory, especially when I'm dealing with the European Union, I'm dealing with the 28 member countries, I'm dealing with other countries that are not in the European Union that are part of my mandate, I'm dealing with the White House leadership. There's a lot of stuff to juggle. And as I said in my opening statement, a phone call for me with the President of the United States or the President of fill-in-the-blank country, while people who get a call like that maybe once in a lifetime, a call like that might be very memorable. They might remember every single thing about it. I'm doing that all day long, and I'm not saying it in a way of being braggadocio or anything like that, but it's part of my routine day. So all of these calls, these meetings with very important people tend to sort of blend together until I have someone that can show me what we discussed, what the subject was, then all of a sudden it comes back.
We're trying to get to the facts here. We're trying to find out what actually happened, what's reliable, what's accurate. Bill Taylor kept notes. He brought
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
As Sean says, it's Wipeout Wednesday. Ambassador Gordon Sondland, the U.S. Ambassador to the European Union, $1 million donor to the Trump campaign, who testified earlier this morning that, yes, there was a quid pro quo, and this came from the president down via Rudy Giuliani, is testifying right now before Congress. He's being interrogated by Mr. Castor, the attorney for the Republicans. Here it is.
Well, what I'm trying to do today is to use the limited information I have to be as forthcoming as possible with you and the rest of the committee. And as these recollections have been refreshed by subsequent testimony, by some texts and emails that I've now had access to, I think I filled in a lot of blanks.
But a lot of it's speculation. A lot of it is your guess, and we're talking about, you know, an impeachment of the President of the United States. So the evidence here ought to be pretty darn good.
I've been very clear as to when I was presuming, and I was presuming on the aid. On the other things, Mr. Castor, I did have some texts that I read from. So when it comes to those, I'll rely on those texts because I don't have any reason to believe that those texts were, you know, falsely sent or that there's some subterfuge there. They are what they are. They say what they say.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Time of the gentleman has expired. We'll now move to a second staff-led round of 30 minutes. Mr. Volker.
This is Adam Schiff, the chairman of the
before I turn
committee.
it back to Mr. Goldman. You testified in response to my colleagues in the minority, something along the lines of, a lot of people did not make the connection between Burisma and Biden. I think a lot of people have real difficulty understanding that. Tim Morrison testified that I think it took him all of doing a Google search to find out, oh, this is the significance of Burisma. It involves the Bidens. Are you saying during all this time up until the call you never made the connection between Burisma and the Bidens? You just thought that the president and Rudy Giuliani were interested in this one particular Ukrainian company?
Again, my role, Mr. Chairman, was just to get the meeting.
Well, I understand that, but my question is, are you saying that for months and months, notwithstanding everything Rudy Giuliani was saying on TV and all the discussion with Rudy Giuliani, that you never put Burisma together with the Bidens?
I didn't, and I wasn't paying attention to what Mr. Giuliani was saying on TV. We were talking to him directly.
Let me ask you this. Ambassador Volker testified yesterday to a similar epiphany, for lack of a better word. This is what
I'm
he
betting
said.
the end game here is pin the tail on
I
Rudy.
now understand
We'll
that
see.
others saw the idea of investigating possible corruption involving the Ukrainian company Burisma as equivalent to investigating former Vice President Biden. I saw them very different, the former being appropriate and unremarkable, the latter being unacceptable. In retrospect, I should have seen that connection differently, and had I done so, I would have raised my own objections. Does that sum up your views as well?
It does.
Now, I think you were asked a question with a bit of a incorrect premise by my colleagues in the minority about Fiona Hill saying that, referring to a drug deal between you and Mr. Mulvaney. It was Ambassador Bolton who made the comment that he didn't want to be part of any drug deal that Ambassador Sondland and Mulvaney were cooking up. No one thinks they're talking about a literal drug deal here or a drug cocktail. The import, I think, of the ambassador's comments is quite clear, that he believed that this bargain, this quid pro quo, as you've described it, over a meeting, the investigations to get the meeting was not something he wanted to be a part of. What I want to ask you about is, he makes reference in that drug deal to a drug deal cooked up by you and Mulvaney. It's the reference to Mulvaney that I want to ask you about. You've testified that Mulvaney was aware of this quid pro quo, of this condition that the Ukrainians had to meet, that is, announcing these public investigations to get the White House meeting. Is that right?
Yeah, a lot of people were aware of it, and
including Mr. Mulvaney.
correct,
And including the Secretary of State.
correct.
Now, have you seen the acting chief of staff's press conference in which he acknowledged that the military aid was withheld in part because of a desire to get that 2016 investigation you've talked about?
I don't think I saw it live. I saw it later, yeah.
So you saw him acknowledge publicly what you have confirmed too, that Mr. Mulvaney understood that 2 + 2 = 4. Is that right?
Well, again, I didn't know that the aid was conclusively tied. I was presuming he was in a position to say yes it was or no it wasn't, because
And he said yes it was, did he not?
he said yes it was.
Mr. Goldman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again, Ambassador Sondland. We do appreciate your efforts to refresh your recollection through the documents, and we understand, we share your frustration in not having the documents to help guide this investigation. So we do appreciate those efforts. One of the documents that you provided to us goes back to the conversation you and the chairman were having about Mr. Mulvaney. And you had been trying for some time before the July 25th call to set up that call, is that right?
To set up the call between President Trump and President Zelensky, yes.
Correct, yes.
Yes.
And I want to show you an email that you reference in your opening statement that is a July 19th email. And who is this from?
It looks like is it from me?
This is an email with Sondland,
from you, I
Perry,
believe.
Yeah,
and
it's from
Mulvaney
me
all
to,
in it.
to the group.
Now, who is the group?
People mentioned on the email: Blair, Kenna, McCormack, Mulvaney, Perry, Pompeo.
And who's Robert Blair?
I believe he's a deputy chief of staff or a advisor to the chief of staff.
And you've already told us that Lisa Kenna is the executive secretary for Secretary Pompeo. Who's Brian McCormack?
The chief of staff for, he was the chief of staff for Secretary Perry.
And then we see Mr. Mulvaney, Secretary Perry, and Secretary Pompeo. Can you read what you wrote on July 19th to this group, please?
He is prepared to receive POTUS call, will assure him that he intends to run a fully transparent investigation, will turn over every stone. He would greatly appreciate a call prior to Sunday so he can put out some media about a friendly and productive call, no details, prior to Ukraine election on Sunday.
So Sunday was the 21st, which was the date of the parliamentary elections in Ukraine, is that right?
That's right.
When you say will assure him that he intends to run a fully transparent investigation and will, quote, turn over every stone, unquote, what do you mean there?
I'm referring to the Burisma and the 2016/DNC server investigations.
Later that evening, Secretary Perry responds just to you and Brian McCormack, saying Mick just confirmed the call being set up for tomorrow by NSC, RP. And then a little later, Mr. Mulvaney replies to all, saying, I asked NSC to set it up for tomorrow. Were these the only responses that you received to this email?
I don't know. If I have them, I would show them. I don't know.
No one wrote back to you and said, what are you talking about in terms of these investigations and turning over every stone?
No, there was a chain, and I don't know if it's part of this email or a subsequent email, where I believe Ambassador Bolton pushed back and said he did not want a call to President Zelensky made by President Trump until after the parliamentary elections.
So that would explain why it was moved from the next day, July 20th, to the 25th, right?
That's right.
But Ambassador Bolton is not on this email, is he?
I don't think he is, no.
Now, you were asked by Mr. Castor if there are any other key witnesses who might be able to help with our investigation. And you mentioned Brian McCormack, right, the Chief of Staff for Secretary Perry?
I did.
You are aware that the committee subpoenaed him, are you not?
I wasn't aware of that.
And that he refused to come testify? Are you also aware that Mr. Mulvaney was subpoenaed by the committee and refused to come testify?
I did read that in the newspaper, yes.
Are you also aware that Robert Blair was subpoenaed and refused to come testify?
I think I'm aware of that.
And that Secretary Perry was asked to come testify and refused?
I am aware of that as well.
So would you include them, as well as Secretary Pompeo, as key witnesses that would be able to provide some additional information on this inquiry?
I think they would.
Now, this was not the first time, as you indicated, that Mr. Mulvaney heard about these investigations into Burisma and the 2016 election. Is that right?
I don't know what Mr. Mulvaney heard or didn't hear. I think there's been a huge amount of exaggeration over my contact with Mr. Mulvaney. It was actually quite limited.
Well, he certainly he certainly indicated a familiarity with what you were talking about in this July 19th email. Is that right?
Because I think Mr. Mulvaney was in the May 23rd briefing with President Trump. I don't remember because there were people sitting behind us that were coming and going when we were sitting in front of President Trump's desk.
Okay. Now, you've said that you don't have a recollection of referencing Mulvaney in the July 10th meeting in Ambassador Bolton's office. Is that right? Or
I don't recall.
So when both Fiona Hill and Colonel Vindman testify that in response to a question from Ukrainian officials at that July 10th meeting about scheduling a White House visit, that you said, well, I spoke with Mr. Mulvaney and it will be scheduled after they announce these investigations. Do you have any reason to dispute that characterization?
I don't have any reason to agree or dispute. I just don't remember.
So if they both remembered it and they both then went and
We're
spoke
listening to the testimony
NSC legal advisor about
EU
it,
Ambassador
you would
Gordon
trust
Sondland,
that whatever they
one of the
relayed
three
to the
amigos,
NSC
who
legal
has
advisor
basically
would likely be
flipped
accurate.
on the president, or at least on Giuliani. And Mike Pence's office has now issued a statement saying, we know nothing about this. I never talked to Gordon Sondland about this stuff in Poland. So it's getting real interesting. Stick around.
This email indicates that
Is the Thom Hartmann Program.
It's Gordon Sondland being interviewed right now by the Democrats' lawyer Daniel
very
Goldman.
senior officials. Is that right?
Which email again?
Sorry, the July 19th email, where you say the subject is I talked to
Yes.
Zelensky just now.
I've got it.
Was there some sort of assurance that President Zelensky needed to provide about what he would say to President Trump in order just to get the phone call?
I think that part was verbal, and then there were a lot of communications going around back and forth with the Ukrainians, and that's when someone, and I don't remember who, came up with the idea of a draft statement so there would be no misunderstanding about what, in fact, the Ukrainians would say and would be willing to say that we could rely on and negotiate something on a piece of paper.
So just to place you in time, we're going to get to that draft statement, which was in August. This is July 19th, before the July 25th call. Do you remember whether there was a need from any of the White House officials or other national security officials for President Zelensky to provide some assurance of what he would say to President Trump before a phone call, not the meeting, but a phone call was scheduled?
There was initially apparently a condition, but that condition was obviously dropped because the phone call took place and there was no such statement made. The phone call took place, as you said, on the 25th of July.
And when you say there was no such statement that took place, what do you mean?
Well, the Ukrainians never made their public statement prior to the phone call on the 25th of July.
Right, but we're not talking about a public statement. What I was asking is whether President Zelensky needed to relay to you or the other American officials that he would assure President Trump that he would do these investigations in a phone call.
In my email, I obviously had just spoken with him, and he being Zelensky, and he said that he was prepared to receive the call and he would make those assurances to President Trump on that call, and then presumably that would then lead to the White House meeting.
And you had been discussing this phone call for several weeks now, is that right?
Yes, with Volker, with Perry, with Giuliani through Volker and Perry.
And then right after you sent this email assuring the others that he will discuss the investigations and will turn over every stone, the Burisma and 2016 election investigations, Mr. Mulvaney responded that he asked to set up the call for the next day. Is that right?
That's what it says.
Now, let's go to that press statement that you were discussing in August. And you testified, I believe, that you understood that Rudy Giuliani was representing the president's interests with regard to Ukraine. Is that right?
That's what we all understood.
And when you all, who do you mean we all?
Secretary Perry, Ambassador Volker, myself.
In August, you and Ambassador Volker were coordinating with Andrei Yermak, the Zelensky aide, about a press statement. And I want to pull up some of the text exchanges that you were referring to, which, as you acknowledge, helps you refresh your recollection. Is that right?
And I think Taylor was involved in those initial discussions as well.
Well, he's not on any of these text messages, so perhaps he was. He does not remember that. But let's go to the first one on August 9th. There's an exchange between Ambassador Volker and you where you are discussing setting up and you say that
We're listening to the Democrats' lawyer Daniel Goldman questioning Gordon Sondland, the U.S. ambassador to the EU, who has basically rolled over on Rudy Giuliani and implicitly on Donald Trump. Here it goes.
What did you mean there?
The commitment to do the investigations.
And how did you know that the president wanted the deliverable?
I don't recall. I may have had a conversation with him, or I may have heard it from someone else, but I don't recall, again, without all these records.
At this point, Giuliani's goose is
Going
so
to the
cooked.
next
The question is, will Trump
10,
speak?
where, or August 10th, rather. This is between you and Andrei Yermak. What did you say initially in this exchange?
Hello? Good? Oh, no, that's Yermak. How was your conversation?
And Mr. Yermak responds, hello, good. My proposal, we receive date, and then we make general statement with discussed things. Once we have a date, we'll call for a press briefing announcing upcoming visit and outlining vision for the reboot of U.S.-Ukraine relationship, including, among other things, Burisma and election meddling and investigations. And you respond, got it. That was your understanding of what this statement had to say to satisfy Mr. Giuliani, is that right?
Yes.
And then ultimately to satisfy the POTUS deliverable?
Yes.
Now, the next day you write an email to Ulrich Breckbull and Lisa Kenna. Are you able to see that on your
Yeah, I can see it on
screen?
the screen, yeah.
Okay. What is the subject of the email?
Ukraine.
And can you read what you wrote there?
Mike, and I'm referring to Secretary Pompeo, Kurt and I negotiated a statement from Zelensky to be delivered for our review in a day or two. The contents will hopefully make the boss happy enough to authorize an invitation. Zelensky plans to have a big presser on the openness subject, including specifics next week.
And in your opening statement, you said that the specifics, what did the specifics represent?
The 2016 and the Burisma,
And when you say
Bingo.
the boss, who do you mean by that?
President Trump.
And the invitation is what?
This is going to be just like with Michael
to the White
Cohen,
House
where,
meeting.
Trump speaks in
And
code.
Lisa Kenner responds,
And Giuliani
Gordon,
takes the
I'll pass
instructions.
to S. And S is Secretary Pompeo?
Correct.
Thank you, Lisa. Now, 2 days later, you have a text exchange with Ambassador Volker again. And this is at the end of it, but the earlier text, which we don't have here, you may recall, includes the press statement, the revised press statement that includes Burisma and the 2016 election. Do you recall that?
Yes, if I could see it, that would be helpful, but yes.
But you ultimately remembered that after your conversation with Mr. Giuliani, you did pass along a statement to the Ukrainians that included Burisma in the 2016 election. Is that right?
I think there were statements being passed back and forth between Volker, the Ukrainians, and others to try and negotiate acceptable language.
Mm-hmm. And ultimately, that statement was not issued, was it?
Correct.
And the White House meeting did not.
Still hasn't occurred.
Still hasn't occurred. But you certainly understood at that time, did you not, that it was the president's direction and instruction that a White House meeting with President Zelensky would not occur until President Zelensky announced publicly the investigations that the president wanted. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you now know that the investigations the president wanted was an investigation into the Bidens and an investigation into the 2016 election.
I know that now, yes.
And that's your incriminating statement. We'll be back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
We're listening to the testimony of Ambassador Gordon Sondland, the EU ambassador who has basically rolled over on Giuliani and Trump.
Secretary Pompeo, CCing Lisa Kenna, the subject of Zelensky. And could you please read what you wrote to Secretary Pompeo?
Mike, should we block time in Warsaw for a short pull-aside for POTUS to meet Zelensky? I would ask Zelensky to look him in the eye and tell him that once Ukraine's new justice folks are in place mid-September, Zelensky should be able to move forward publicly and with confidence on those issues of importance to POTUS and to the U.S. Hopefully that will break the logjam.
And Secretary Pompeo responds to you 3 minutes later, yes. Now, I want to unpack this a little bit. You said that in the middle, once Ukraine's new justice folks are in place. What did you mean by that?
The new prosecutor that was going to be working for President Zelensky, the old prosecutor, I believe his term was up or he was being let go. He was the Poroshenko prosecutor, and Zelensky wanted to wait until his person was in place.
So once that new prosecutor was in place, then President Zelensky, should be able to move forward publicly and with confidence on those issues of importance to POTUS. What did you mean by those issues of importance to POTUS?
Again, the 2016 election and Burisma investigation.
Were you aware at this time that Secretary Pompeo had listened in to the July 25th phone call?
I was not.
If he had, do you believe that he would fully understand what the issues of importance to POTUS related to Ukraine would be?
I mean, I can't characterize his state of mind. He listened in on the phone call and he concluded what he concluded.
But now that you've read the phone call, it's quite clear what the issues of importance to POTUS are.
Yes.
Biden investigation and
Yes.
the 2016 election investigation. Is that right?
That's correct.
Then it says, hopefully, that will break the logjam. Now, by this point, you were aware that security assistance had been on hold for about 5 weeks. Is that right?
I became aware on the 18th of July.
And you understood that there was a lot of activity within the State Department and elsewhere to try to get that hold lifted. Is that right?
That's right.
Just about everybody in the interagency, meaning the national security apparatus, wanted to lift the hold and wanted the aid to go to Ukraine?
Correct.
So what did you mean here when you said logjam?
Well, as I said to Chairman Schiff, I meant inclusively anything that was holding up moving forward on the meeting and the Ukraine-U.S. relationship.
And what was holding that up?
At that point, it was the statements about Burisma and the 2016 elections.
But what was being held up?
Well, the aid was being held up, obviously.
4 days later, you said in your opening statement that you sent Rudy Giuliani's contact information to John Bolton. Is that right?
I did.
Did you know why he asked for that?
No idea.
Did you know that he was going to Ukraine the next day?
I knew he was about to go to Ukraine. I didn't know exactly when his trip was, but I thought it was kind of an odd request, given that the White House can pretty much get anyone's phone number they want.
Now, in this email to Secretary Pompeo, you reference a trip to Warsaw. Ultimately, the vice president went on that trip,
That's correct.
and that was the conversation that you talked about, where you testified earlier to that, where you said that we really need to get these investigations from Ukraine in order to release the aid in the pre-meeting?
That's right.
And Vice President Pence just nodded
He heard what I said.
and didn't respond in any way.
I don't recall any substantive response.
But you never specifically referenced the Bidens or Burisma in that meeting, did you?
I don't remember ever mentioning the Bidens. I may have mentioned Burisma.
And that meeting was with a group. You were not alone with Vice President Pence.
That's
Is that
correct.
right? And you know that at that bilateral meeting with President Zelensky, I believe you testified earlier, that Vice President Pence did not mention these investigations at all, right?
I don't recall him mentioning the investigations.
So that your testimony is just simply in a pre-meeting with a group of Americans before the bilateral meeting. You referenced the fact that Ukraine needed to do these investigations in order to lift the aid. Right?
I think I referenced, I didn't say that Ukraine had to do the investigations. I think I said that we heard from Mr. Giuliani that that was the case.
So that helped inform your presumption, correct?
Correct.
So it wasn't really a presumption. You heard from Mr. Giuliani.
Well, I didn't hear from Mr. Giuliani about the aid. I heard about the Burisma in 2016.
And you understood at that point, as we discussed 2 + 2 = 4, that
That's
the
right.
aid was there as well.
That was the problem, Mr. Goldman. No one told me directly that the aid was tied to anything. I was presuming it was.
Right. Well, I want to go ahead to, I want to go back on September 1st, or I'm going to jump actually ahead to September 7th, okay? When we discussed those text messages where you said there were multiple convos with President Zelensky and POTUS, you recall that?
Do you have the email by any chance?
We could try to pull it up in a second, but you don't remember I showed it to you
Yeah,
this
go
morning?
ahead, though, with your question.
And you confirmed that that likely meant, as you said it did, that you spoke with President Trump. Is that right?
Again, if my email said I spoke with President Trump, presumably I did.
You are relying pretty heavily in your testimony on the texts and emails that you were able to review. Is that right?
That's right.
So certainly if someone else had contemporaneous
So Ambassador Gordon
texts,
Sondland is
emails,
testifying
notes,
right now. He's being questioned by Mr. Goldman, the attorney for the Democrats. They only have about 3 minutes left. Just a minute ago, he said, "No one told me that the aid was directly tied to anything. That was my presumption." I guarantee you that's going to be the thing that the Republicans hammer him with. Oh, you just presumed. And therefore, we're supposed to remove the president from office. Meanwhile, Mike Pence just issued a statement, quote, "The vice president never had a conversation with Gordon Sondland about investigating the Bidens, Burisma, or the conditional release of financial aid to Ukraine based upon potential investigations." Ambassador Gordon Sondland was never alone with Vice President Pence on the September 1 trip to Poland. The alleged discussion recalled by Ambassador Sondland never happened. Multiple witnesses have testified under oath that Vice President Pence never raised Hunter Biden, former, blah, 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 at the meeting in Poland. So back to the hearings.
Mr. Morrison's testimony about that conversation, do you?
No.
On September 8th, you then had a conversation directly with Ambassador Taylor
One of the problems,
about
by the way, that
this same phone
Sondland
call,
has is
where
that the
Ambassador
State Department
Taylor
refuses
said
to allow
that
him to review his own
confirmed
notes.
that you spoke to President Trump, as he had suggested earlier to you, and that President Trump was adamant that President Zelensky himself, meaning not the prosecutor general, had to, quote, "clear things up and do it in public," unquote. Do you recall, you don't have any reason to think that Ambassador Taylor's testimony based on his contemporaneous notes was...
I don't know if I got that from President Trump or I got it from Giuliani. That's the part I'm not clear on.
Well, Ambassador Taylor is quite clear that you said President Trump. Mr. Morrison is also quite clear that you said President Trump. You don't have any reason to dispute their very specific recollections, do you?
No, if they have notes and they recall that, I don't have any reason to dispute it. I just personally can't remember where I got it from.
And then you also told Ambassador Taylor in that same conversation that if President Zelensky, you told President Zelensky and Andrei Yermak that although this was not a quid pro quo, as the president had very clearly told you, it was, however, required for President Zelensky to clear things up in public, or there would be a stalemate. You don't have any reason to dispute Ambassador Taylor's recollection of that conversation you had with President Zelensky, do you?
No.
And that you understood the stalemate referenced the aid, is that correct?
At that point, yes.
Ambassador Taylor also described a comment that you made where you were trying to explain what President Trump's view of this was. And you said that President Trump is a businessman. When a businessman is about to sign a check to someone who owes him something, the businessman asks the person to pay up before signing the check. Do you recall saying that to Ambassador Taylor?
I don't recall it specifically, but I may have.
And Ambassador Volker also said that you did.
Okay.
So just to summarize here, by the end of the first week of September, before the aid had been released, you had expressed twice to the Ukrainians that you understood that the investigations needed to be publicly announced.
Rudy
on
Giuliani
CNN
just tweeted, I
in
came
order
into this
for
at
the
Volker's
aid to be
request.
released. Do you
Sondland is
recall that?
speculating based on
I didn't say
very
that
all
they had to
caps
be
little
announced on
contact. I
CNN.
never
The
met him, had very
Ukrainians
few
said
calls with
to
him, mostly
me
with
or
Volker.
to
Volker
Ambassador
testified, I
Volker,
answered
or
their
both of
questions
us,
and described them
that they
as
had
my
planned to
opinions,
do an
not demands,
interview
i.e.
anyway
no
on
quid
CNN,
pro
and they
quo.
would use
Back
that
to the hearing.
occasion to mention these items.
And that even though at some point you had calculated 2 + 2 to equal 4, and therefore you believed that the aid was conditioned on the investigations, that you had a phone call with President Trump that you relayed to both Tim Morrison and Ambassador Taylor, whose accounts of that conversation you do not dispute, where President Trump confirmed that President Zelensky needed to publicly announce the investigations,
Okay.
or otherwise the obvious implication of the stalemate would be that the aid would not be released. Is that correct?
Again, the implication, I did not hear directly from President Trump that the aid would be held up until the statement was made. I did not hear those words.
But you agree that with whatever Mr. Morrison and Ambassador Taylor testified to about the conversation you had with President Trump. Is that right?
Remind me again, I don't want to misspeak.
Well, you just said you have no reason to dispute their accounts based on their detailed notes.
Were they saying that I told them that President Trump said that the aid would not be released until the statements were made? Because I said repeatedly, I don't recall President Trump ever saying that to me.
Okay.
I think what they said, if I could just finish this line of
Yeah.
questioning,
Yeah.
was that President Trump was adamant that President Zelensky himself had to clear things up, quote, clear things up and do it in public, unquote. So what they related was, although President Trump claimed to you there was no quid pro quo, he also made it clear to you in that call that President Zelensky had to, quote, clear things up and do it in public. You don't have a reason to dispute, that's what you
I don't
told
have any reason to dispute the clear things up and do it in public. What I'm trying to be very clear about was President Trump never told me directly that the aid was tied to that statement.
But in that same conversation you had with him about the aid, about the quid pro quo, he told you that President Zelensky had to, quote, clear things up and do it in public, correct?
I did not have a conversation with him about the aid. I had a conversation with him, as referenced in my text, about quid pro quo.
Well, the quid pro quo you were discussing was over the aid, correct?
No. President Trump, when I asked him the open-ended question, as I testified previously, what do you want from Ukraine? His answer was, I want nothing. I want no quid pro quo. Tell Zelensky to do the right thing. That's all I got from President Trump.
Did you also get from President Trump, as reflected by Ambassador Taylor, that he said he was adamant that President Zelensky had to, quote, clear things up and do it in public?
That part I can agree to, yes.
Time is now with the minority for 20 minutes. I'm sorry, 33 minutes.
So now we go to Devin Nunes and the attorney, Mr. Castor, for the Republicans.
Ambassador, you've been in
This is Devin
business for a
Nunes.
long time.
The guy who's
Yeah.
suing the imaginary cow.
So if you want to get to the bottom of something, somebody that's running a department or one of your buildings or something, who do you go to?
The boss.
The manager of whatever company
Exactly.
it is. Right?
Correct.
So if you want to get to the bottom of foreign aid, probably go to the people that are in charge of foreign aid here in this town, wouldn't you? Because you're not in charge of foreign aid.
I'm not in charge of foreign aid.
And you've had to testify that you've presumed foreign aid was this or that, and you're guessing that this was tied to foreign aid.
See,
But
as
there
I
are people
predicted,
in this
this
town
is,
who
Nunes
are in
is going
charge
to be
of the
saying,
foreign
oh,
aid.
you're guessing.
And in fact, I don't think it's very fair to you.
Because Trump did just
at all,
what Michael
or to
Cohen
us,
said he
or
would
the
do, talk in
American people.
code.
You might be surprised that we had that person here in the Capitol in a secret deposition in the basement last Saturday. Now, that testimony might be pretty important to you before you're here to testify. If you could have read that, your lawyers could have went through that, because it may have clarified some more things for you about your recollection about the foreign aid. So, we've heard earlier, we heard about we had the chair looking at the cameras, telling American people, talking about Watergate with their Watergate fantasies that they continue to,
Stephanie Grisham, the White House press secretary, just sent out an official statement to the press pool saying Sondland's testimony made clear that in one of the few brief phone calls he had with President Trump, the president stated that he, quote, wanted nothing, end quote, from Ukraine, and he repeated, quote, no quid pro quo over and over again, close quote. In fact, no quid pro quo ever occurred. The U.S. aid flowed to Ukraine. No investigation was launched. And President Trump has met and spoken with President Zelensky. Democrats keep chasing ghosts. End of quote from the press secretary for the White House.
Transcript of the man who's in charge of the foreign aid in this town. Now, I could get into what he said, but the chair could release what he said. And we're not even allowed to call that witness here today. So let's talk about things that we do know are facts. Okay, as best as I think you and I and most people know them. President Trump does not like foreign aid to start with. Is that correct, Ambassador?
I've heard that, yes.
And you've testified that watching over the EU, you have 28 countries, you have neighboring countries that you work with. One of his biggest complaints is the lack of participation that those countries participate in programs around the world. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Especially NATO,
Yes.
right? That's one of when you go down the list of the jobs when you get directions from the White House, when you first became ambassador, probably one of the number one things, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but on the top of the list was making sure countries pay their fair share, especially with NATO.
Yeah, and we have a very capable ambassador to NATO, so I'm not going to take her lane.
But it's one of you work with those countries. It's one of the issues that you
Over
bring
on
up in
Fox
your
News,
meetings,
Ken
correct?
Starr is wondering if this might cause some Republican senators to go over to the White House.
I know you weren't on the July
shades
25th
of Richard
phone
Nixon,
call,
right?
but one of the first things that the President of the United States brings up is Germany's lack of participation. I think he names the President of Germany directly, that they're not participating in helping out Ukraine, who's one of their neighbors. Is that what you read in the transcript?
I've heard that, yes.
So the whole idea that the president starting out with, he doesn't like foreign aid, he doesn't think countries pay their fair share, that's looking out for the taxpayer. But there's more, and we talked about this in your deposition. We talked about it, about how we have requirements. The Congress writes requirements into the law that require you and all the diplomats to carry out the foreign policy of this country for the President of the United States. Before the President can certify foreign aid and send foreign aid, there has to be certification that there's no corruption. You're aware of that now?
I am now, yes.
So being that you learned about that in your deposition, now looking back at clearly the challenges and concerns the president had with the involvement of high-level Ukrainian government officials, including the ambassador here in the United States that attacked him during his presidential campaign, the concerns of leaks that were leaks or just made up stories and conspiracy theories that were spun in the Steele dossier that the Democrats on this committee own. They paid for it. other DNC operatives that were working with the Ukrainian ambassador here in Washington, D.C., to dirty up your boss, the President of the United States. We're not going to hear from those witnesses. Just like we're not going to hear from the person we deposed on Saturday.
This is so rich. The White House is preventing
what the real
John
reason,
Eisenberg, Mick Mulvaney, Rudy Giuliani, Rick Perry, Mike Pompeo, John Bolton, Charles Kupperman, Robert Blair, Brian McCormick, Michael Ellis, and Bill Barr from testifying before these hearings. And they're keeping all of Sondland's notes away from him. They're refusing to allow him access to any of his own information. And here's Devin Nunes complaining that he can't pull a witness up.
Wouldn't it be easier if you just knew exactly why the foreign aid wasn't given?
Yes, it would be easy. Give me access to the damn State Department information.
If I had a totality of the record.
And would you trust the person who's in charge of cutting the checks for foreign aid, the top career diplomat or the top career official?
I'd have no reason not to.
That's the guy that Nunes is saying they interviewed in the basement.
Ambassador, I don't know if we'll get
who is not testifying.
Speak again if we have some more magical minutes. But I'm done with questions with you. I know the rest of our members have more questions. Let me turn to, I know Mr. Castor has some more questions.
This is Mr. Castor, the attorney
Ambassador.
for the Republicans.
Hi.
We'll try not to use all of this time as a courtesy to you. Just want to go through some distinctions between your opener and your deposition and some other witnesses. In your opening statement today,
Ken Starr over on Fox News just said, we now know that the president, in fact, committed the crime of bribery. I think articles of impeachment are being drawn up if they haven't already been drawn up. Amazing. This testimony is an absolute screaming blowtorch. We'll be back with more of Ambassador Sondland, Gordon Sondland, the Portland hotel magnate, who is the ambassador to the EU, testifying.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archive.
He's also objected to the characterization of him and the other amigos as the irregular channel because he says Pompeo knew about this. All these guys knew about this.
And you've got some bad people around him. I mean, that referring to the Ukrainian. Ambassador Volker hasn't testified that there's any sort of order or direction to talk to Rudy.
I don't know what he testified. It became very clear to all three of us that if we wanted to move the relationship forward, President Trump was not really interested in engaging. He wanted Rudy to handle it. And as I said in my opening statement, Secretary Perry took the lead and made the initial contact with Rudy, and that's when we began working with him.
And as to the question of whether Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desire specifically of the President of the United States, in your deposition, you said, I don't know. I don't know if this was coming out of Rudy Giuliani irrespective of the President. Correct?
I'm not going to dispute what I said in my deposition.
Okay.
That's true, yeah.
And we walked through all your communications with Rudy Giuliani, and they're not a lot, right?
Correct.
Ambassador Volker, in his deposition on the same question, said, I did not have that impression. I believe Mr. Giuliani was doing his own communications. And, granted, Mr. Giuliani had business interests in Ukraine, correct?
Now I understand he did.
Okay.
I didn't know that at the time.
With Messrs. Parnas and Fruman, correct?
A lot of new names I've learned.
Okay, and you had never met with those folks?
No.
And then in your September 9th communication with the president, during your deposition, that was a striking moment when you walked us through your telephone call with President Trump on September 9th.
And by the way, I still cannot find a record of that call because the State Department and the White House cannot locate it, but I'm pretty sure I had the call on that day.
But whether it was the 9th or the 8th, you had this call. It was extremely memorable, right?
It was.
And you've been very honest, and we're not trying to give you a hard time on all the times you don't recall. We're just trying to say that there's a lot of important events that have happened that the committee's asked you about, and you've honestly said, I don't recall. But the call with President Trump on September 9th or the 8th, you recall it vividly, right?
I recall it vividly because it was keyed by the sort of frantic emails from Ambassador Taylor. I had, again, prior to that call, had all kinds of theories as to why things weren't moving, why there was no White House meeting, why there was no aid, why there was no this, why there was no that. And I was getting tired of going around in circles, frankly. So I made the call, and I asked, as I said, the open-ended question, what do you want from Ukraine?
And
that's when I got the answer.
He was unequivocal, nothing.
What I said in the text is what I heard.
And I'm curious, was that vignette in your opener today?
I don't think so.
How come? That's so memorable, so striking.
I don't know. It was in my previous testimony, and I assumed if people had questions, they would bring it up.
Okay. I mean, this is an example, a lot of witnesses during the course of this investigation have dealt with ambiguities in different ways, and some have resolved them in the light least favorable to the president over and over again. This is an exculpatory fact shedding some light on the president's state of mind about the situation about the,
And I'm happy to discuss it.
So I'm just wondering why you didn't mention it in your opener.
There were so many things I wanted to include in my opening, and my opening was already, I think, 45 minutes or something. It would have been an hour and a half. There are a lot of things I'd like to have mentioned.
Okay, but you only had a couple conversations with the president. And we're trying to evaluate whether
It was not
president.
purposeful, trust me.
Talking about striking conversations, Mr. Holmes, when he came here last Friday in the basement, I'll tell you, he thought your conversation that you had with the president was like the most memorable thing he's ever experienced.
How many conversations has he had
To
with the
speak to
president?
some reporters, he's holding handwritten notes. He said, and I quote, "I don't know him
But
very
he
well. I have not
was,
spoken to him much. This is not a man I know well. He seems like a nice guy, though."
About telling us about this conversation.
And we'll learn more
Not
about
only
that
did
as
I
it
buy
goes
him
on.
lunch, but I also provided
Anyhow, this is Gordon Sondland being interviewed by the counsel for the Republicans, Mr.
Anyone
Kester.
that he came across with this story. And that's, I guess, a discussion for Thursday. But other than the colorful language, and he was definitely moved by the color, but he was unequivocal that you brought up the Bidens in the post-call discussion. And he said something to the effect of the president's only interested in big things, and Mr. Holmes said that, there's a lot of big things going on in the Ukraine, like there are. There's a war. Ukraine's under attack from the east by Russia. And he puts words in your mouth to the effect of, no, the president only cares about investigations like Rudy is pitching about the Bidens. And what's important about this is the day after the 725 call. And what's reported by Mr. Holmes, and you, to the extent you've confirmed it, isn't anything different than happened on the 725 call. Agreed? From the president's standpoint?
With 2020 hindsight, now that we've had the transcript of the call, the Bidens were clearly mentioned on the call, but I wasn't making the connection with the Bidens.
Right, but with regard to the president, it was just mentioning investigations.
That's all he said on the phone was
Oh,
investigation.
this is interesting. Rudy Giuliani just
you
deleted
told
that
us
tweet that I
time
read
and
to you
again
earlier, where
you
he said, "I
never
came into this at Volker's
realized the
request.
Bidens were
Sondland is
part
speculating
of
based on very little
any of
contact.
this.
I never met him and had very
You
few
talked
calls
about
with him,
a
mostly with
continuum.
Volker.
And you
Volker
never
testified,
came
I
to
answered their
understand
questions
that
and described them
until
as my opinions, not demands,
as late
i.e.
as
no quid pro
September
quo."
25th,
That would be
right?
the
No, the
tweet
exact date,
that
but it was pretty
Giuliani put out that would have
And
defended
Ambassador Volker
Trump.
said the Bidens never came up
Giuliani
after
just
his one
deleted it.
breakfast
Amazing.
meeting with Mayor Giuliani, where he testified that he tried to disabuse the mayor of anything relating to the Bidens.
And I think Secretary Perry publicly stated that he never heard Biden either until
Okay.
the end.
So when you testify here today that you have no recollection of mentioning the Bidens to Mr. Holmes, that's not just a recollection, that's based on your state of mind at that point in time and your state of mind up to September 25th, correct?
I wasn't into investigating the Bidens.
So it's very surprising to you that he would mention that, right?
It was very surprising to me.
I want to go back to a couple things.
This was this amazing quote from
July
Sondland. He
26th
says,
meeting with
I don't know how you can
President
characterize it as an irregular
Earlier-
channel if you're
earlier
talking
in the
about the
day
President
from
of the
this,
United States, the Secretary of
launch
State, the Chief of Staff, and the Secretary of Energy.
Event we've been talking about. During the course of the meeting with President Zelensky, did any of the parties discuss what came up on the telephone call?
I don't believe so.
Okay, so President Zelensky didn't express any concerns about the content of the call, right?
I mean,
David
all I heard
Frum
about
just
that
tweeted,
call
this
was
is
that it was a good
hysterical.
call.
Successful
It was
real estate
friendly, everyone
entrepreneur
was
sees no
happy.
reason to go to prison
I
for
was
unsuccessful
delighted to hear
real estate
that,
entrepreneur.
So that we could now move to the next
Okay.
phase, which was the meeting.
Okay. So you can tell us with certainty that nobody talked about demands in that meeting or fulfilling the president's demands?
I don't remember exactly. Again, this is a great example, Mr. Castro, of where I would have loved to have seen the notes from the meeting. I didn't take
Back
any
on
notes, but
October
I know there
8th,
were
Donald
notes
Trump
taken.
tweeted, I would love to send Ambassador Sondland, a really good man and great American, to testify, but unfortunately he would be testifying before a totally compromised kangaroo court where Republicans' rights have been taken away and true facts are not allowed out in the public. Yeah. Trump's tweets really age well, right? We're listening to the hearings. We'll be back right after the news here
You
at the top
don't
of the hour.
remember any discussion of by President Zelensky of lamenting how he had to navigate this difficult situation, right?
I don't know. I know that was in the whistleblower complaint, something about navigating something. I didn't remember anything like that.
And I want to get back to your.
Gentlemen, yield just a second.
Of course.
Which would be another helpful thing also, Ambassador, is if we actually had heard from the whistleblower and we had testimony of the whistleblower. Then you wouldn't have to be up here speculating as much and guessing because you would have a source that would have been interviewed. We have his complaint. We could have matched it up with your testimony along with the people from OMB that would have made it very easy for you to testify so you wouldn't have to just try to remember all this stuff and chase conspiracy theories around that the Democrats have continued to lay out for the last 6 weeks, moving from quid pro quo to extortion to bribery to where are we at today, obstruction of justice, and now back to quid pro quo. We wouldn't have had to do all that if the whistleblower would have testified. You wouldn't have to speculate about what the whistleblower only had in his or her complaint that nobody seems to know. Back to Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Mr. Nunes. I want to turn to a couple of times in your opener, you said everyone was in the loop. And I just want to, these televised proceedings, sometimes we lose track of things and everyone was not in the loop with your speculation or your guess that in the absence of any credible explanation for the suspension of aid, I later came to believe that the resumption of security aid would not occur without public statement from the Ukraine. Everyone wasn't in the loop with that, right?
Well, the secretary was, because that's why I sent my email.
But your emails, let's look at your emails. There's 2 emails that you sent to the secretary, right?
Mm-hmm.
Better here?
August 22nd,
Right, and August 11th?
August 11th.
So the August 11th email, we went through this before. I'm sorry to go through it again. You said to the secretary, Kurt and I negotiated a statement from Z to be delivered for our review in a day or 2. The contents will hopefully make the boss happy enough to authorize an invitation. Z plans to have a big presser on the openness subject next week. A couple things here. This is only relating to the White House meeting, correct?
Yes, I believe so.
And this is only, this is just investigations generally, making a public statement of openness generally, right?
Well, I think by August 11th, Mr. Castor, I think we were talking about 2016 in Burisma. The investigations generally was really early in the...
Okay, but do we know that Secretary Pompeo knows that?
I think so. I think...
Why?
Well, only because I think Counselor Breckbull was briefed
Okay.
on all of these things, and
By who? By you?
by I believe Ambassador Volker, by myself, various
That's not what he testified to. I mean, did you,
Ambassador or Counselor Breckbull testified? I didn't know he had testified.
no, Ambassador Volker.
Oh, okay.
He didn't testify that he briefed Mr. Breckbuell. I mean, this email to the secretary is talking about this statement, which, by the way, I mean, you said Kurt and I negotiated a statement, and the statement never went.
Didn't go anywhere.
Ambassador Volker said it wasn't a good idea. Mr. Yarmark said it wasn't a good idea. But what you're writing to the secretary here is just it relates to a generic openness subject, right?
Yeah, but I think the secretary, though, was on the July 25th call, which obviously I wasn't on and I didn't know about.
Okay, but you used this email to suggest that everyone was in the loop, that like security sector assistance was tied to some sort of act by the Ukrainians.
No, I don't think I said that. I don't think I said that this assistance was involved here.
Okay.
I think I
so
was.
what was everyone in the loop about then?
Well, the secretary was in the loop that we had negotiated a statement.
Okay.
I'm fairly comfortable that the secretary knows that where the statement was at that point. In other words, the 2016 in Burisma, and that Lisa passed that along to him and kept him informed.
Okay, so we can agree that at this point in time, the secretary wasn't in a loop, that there was a conditionality on the security sector assistance.
Hold on a second. Are you asking about July 19th, Exhibit 4?
I was asking about your email to the secretary on August 11th.
Oh, okay.
Well,
on July 19th, which the secretary was on, I talked about fully transparent investigation and turn over every stone. And the secretary was on that.
okay.
So,
But you testified at your deposition that on July 19th, in this continuum you talked about,
yeah.
at that point in the continuum, it was just a generic investigation. Wasn't anything involving.
I think it went, again, I'm not trying to put words in any way. I think it went from the original generic from, May 23rd when we left the Oval Office. We're talking about corruption and oligarchs until Mr. Giuliani started to become involved, and then it transitioned into the Burisma.
You hadn't even talked to Giuliani by that time. This is July 19th.
Mr. Castro, with all respect, will you allow him to finish his answer, please?
Sorry, use the mic.
Will you allow him to finish his answer?
Of course, I apologize.
We were communicating with Mr. Giuliani through Mr. Giuliani directly.
Okay.
Until after August 1st.
But as of July,
Secretary Perry and through Ambassador Volker. I wasn't talking to.
still on the generic part of the continuum?
I don't know. I believe by then we were talking about Burisma in 2016, to be candid.
But not Biden.
No, not Biden.
Okay.
No.
And then turning to your email of August 11th.
Yeah, got it.
I'm sorry, we just dealt with that. August the 22nd.
22nd?
Yeah, it's page 23 of your opener.
Yeah, I got it.
And this is where you were requesting a pull aside for the president, and this is when the president was
He was still going to go.
going to
yes.
go. It was before
Yeah.
the hurricane.
Right.
Bump that off his schedule. I would ask Zelensky to look him in the eye and tell him that once Ukraine's new justice folks are in place, Zelensky should be able to move forward publicly and with confidence on those issues of importance to the president and the United States. Hopefully that'll break the logjam. And at this point in time, the issues of importance to the president of the United States were what?
The two investigations.
Okay. But nothing to do with Vice President Biden, right?
Again,
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
So we're listening to the testimony of Ambassador Gordon Sondland. He is being interrogated by Mr. Castor, the Republican lawyer. Basically, it looks like the main Republican attack now is, well, the president never told you quid pro quo. You never heard that explicitly. You just drew that conclusion, and he's saying, yeah, that's true. So that's going to be the major point. Trump just went out and told the reporters basically that. Rudy Giuliani had tweeted something to that effect, but he's now deleted his tweet, which is getting very, very interesting.
Generally aware.
And basically what Castor is trying to do now, I think, is provide some safety to Mike Pompeo. So here we go.
And Ambassador Hale testified, and his testimony's been public, almost a zero-based concept, that each assistance program and each country that receives the program be evaluated. The program made sense, that we avoid nation building, and that we not provide assistance to countries that are lost to us in terms of policy, whether it's because corruption or another reason. Is that something you were aware of at the time?
Generally, yes.
Okay. And you're certainly aware that the president was concerned about the European allies.
Mike Pence is polishing his Bible, getting ready to take the Oval Office.
Exactly why I was involved.
Okay. So, as we get down to September 11th, right before you're advocating that the pause be lifted, correct?
Yeah, I personally didn't think the pause should have ever been put in place. Yeah.
But as we get down to September 11th and you're talking with Senator Johnson and so forth, you don't know with certainty that the genuine reason the president was implementing
So this is my point. You don't know for sure.
Wasn't because of his concerns about the allies or his concerns about foreign assistance generally, or that he wasn't just trying to hold the aid as long as he could to see what he could, what type of information.
And until the White House releases all those documents, none of us will know either.
Okay.
But the White House ain't releasing nothing.
I am really trying to finish up before so I can yield some time back. Do we have anything else, Mr.
I have nothing else.
That's his way of saying, I don't really know what to say now. I'm just totally screwed here, and I'm hoping Devin Nunes will bail me out. And Nunes is sitting there going, don't look at me. By the way, a bunch of the Republicans left about 15, 20 minutes ago. They just walked out, and they're hanging out someplace. God only knows.
Let's take a 30-minute recess to allow
and there we go.
Ambassador Sondland.
We're going to take a recess.
The members of the committee might like to get a bite
I'm unlocking our phone lines
and then
here,
we will
so if you have any
resume with
thoughts
the
or
member
want to share
rounds of
any
questioning
opinions,
5 minutes.
feel free to give us a
If
shout.
we could allow the witnesses to.
And there's a lot going on here, a lot to unpack. Basically, Gordon Sondland came out. He made this statement. He used, the magic words. He said things like, yes, there was a quid pro quo. And, if you think back to Michael Cohen and Michael Cohen's testimony, in Michael Cohen's testimony before Congress, before he was sent off to prison for participating in a scheme to cover up Donald Trump's affairs. He's sitting in prison in part because he paid off Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal, a violation of campaign finance laws, and then he lied about that under oath to Congress. So, in line to Congress. So Cohen made the point, and I think it's a really good point. He made the point that you have to understand how Trump talks. Trump talks like a mob boss. Trump has never sent an email, will not send an email. He only rarely handles things over the telephone, only if he absolutely has to. He would prefer to do it in person. This is how mafioso work, right? And Sondland is saying, I called Trump. In fact, he called Trump from Ukraine, and he said, what do you want? I just talked to the president of Ukraine, and I'm trying to figure out what the heck do you want? What's it going to take for you to release this military aid, and invite the president of Ukraine over for a meeting in the Oval Office so that he can say to his people, yes, we have the backing of the United States, our most important ally. And Trump just flipped out. Started yelling at him about, he said Trump was very angry. started yelling at him about, there is no quid pro quo. I don't want anything. No quid pro quo. And of course, obviously Trump had been doing his mob boss thing, right? Up until that point, he had been basically saying, well, it's, this is even in Shakespeare, will nobody rid me of this meddlesome priest? And it was Hamlet, right? And yeah, the people around you know what you're saying. They know what's going on. So anyhow, let's pick up some of your thoughts and calls as well. By the way, if you haven't been listening to my commentary here over the last hour, I pointed out that Rudy Giuliani tweeted out that, I did nothing, everything's good, and then he deleted his own tweet. Mike Pence's office has come out with a statement now that said, quote, the vice president never had a conversation with Gordon Sondland about investigating the Biden's Burisma or the conditional release of financial aid based upon potential investigations. Ambassador Gordon Sondland was never alone with Vice President Pence on the September 1 trip to Poland. This alleged discussion recalled by Sondland never happened. Multiple witnesses have testified under oath, blah, 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 blah. So my take on this, just to summarize, then I'll pick up your phone calls. My take on this is that Sondland figured out that everybody was pointing at him as the fall guy, that he was going to be the one, that the people around the president, that Trump, Pompeo, Giuliani, they had all decided, let's make Sondland the fall guy. He's the outsider. He's this guy from Portland, Oregon. He's just a millionaire who owns a bunch of hotels. To hell with him. We'll let him take the fall for this. And Sondland figured out that they had figured that out and said, I'm nobody's fall guy. It ain't going to happen. So, this is where we're at. Chuck in Indianapolis. Hey, Chuck, what's on your mind?
Hi, Tom. I'm calling as a former Reformed Republican. They've lost me. They're spending way more time tarnishing the character of their witnesses than challenging facts and evidence.
Well, another thing that I mentioned in the previous hour is that over on Fox News, and I'm getting this secondhand through the New York Times, kind of live blog on the testimony, but apparently over on Fox News, Ken Starr, the guy who prosecuted Bill Clinton, came out and said that he wonders if soon there's going to be a group of Republican senators visiting the White House, which, of course, is what, Barry Goldwater and a couple of other people did when they went over and talked to Nixon and said, sorry, you're going to have to resign.
It's a sad state of affairs. I'm a retired military officer, and from the president besmirching General Mattis to Nunes and Jim Jordan going after Lieutenant Colonel Vindman yesterday,
right.
I'm disgusted by that stuff. I'm just absolutely disgusted.
Yeah. Well, and look at what Trump did with the family of, I believe it was Captain Khan, the police or the officer who was killed in Iraq, and his father, spoke out, and Trump trashed them. The Gold Star family. I mean, it's amazing. Chuck, thank you very much. Thanks for the call and thanks for sharing your perspective, particularly as a former Republican and as a former member of the armed services. Thank you. I appreciate that. Jacob in Oceanside, California. Hey, Jacob, what's up?
Hi, Tom. Thank you for all you do. I just want to say that I think people today realize the corruption ran deep and the exposure of the testimony is damning. I mean, we have to get it now that Trump is really linked to Putin. And, we just see the surface of things, but it runs deep.
Yeah, and I don't think it's just Putin. I don't think it's that, there's one particular guy pulling the strings here. I think this is Trump's self-interest, Trump wanting to make himself rich. He wants to have a hotel in Moscow, so he's dancing to Putin's tune. He's already got a hotel in Turkey, so he's dancing to Erdogan's tune. The Saudis are telling him that they're going to give him hundreds of millions of dollars to build a Trump Tower in Saudi Arabia when he leaves office, so he's dancing to their tunes. Khashoggi? I don't know anything about Khashoggi. Oh, my son-in-law told Mohammed bin Salman, okay, go take him out. I don't know anything about that. He's what Donald Trump is doing is what he's done his entire life. He's scheming and scamming and grifting in order to try to make himself richer, and right now to try to stay out of jail.
And I think Perry, with that oil deal, I think Trump's getting some kind of cut there. that we
Oh,
don't
yeah.
know about.
Yeah, now we've got troops in Syria to protect the oil. By the way, as we speak, Israel right now is bombing the bejesus out of Syria. And that could go sideways really fast. We'll be back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be back with more of your thoughts and mine on the testimony that we're hearing today from Ambassador Gordon Sondland. There's also going to be some more testimony this afternoon. I'll fill you in later. And welcome back. Corky in Rochester, New York. Hey, Corky, what's on your mind today? Hey, Corky, you got to take me off speakerphone right now, or I'm going to put you on hold.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to put you on hold. Chaz in Lakewood, Washington. Hey, Chaz, what's up?
Nazadrovia, comrade. Is it a beautiful day in America?
In Trumpistan, yes. I got it.
I want to know, man. It's like I'm starting to look towards the future. How many people do you think are going to have to get pardons out of this?
Well, that's a really, really interesting question. And another piece of that question is, let me just share with you from Article 2 of the Constitution. Here it is. This is Article 2, Section 2. The President shall be the Commander-in-Chief of the Army, Navy, Militia, blah-de-blah-de-blah. He may require the opinion in writing to the principal officer in each of the executive departments upon any subject relating to the duties of their respective offices, comma, and he shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, comma, except in cases of impeachment. Now, this has never been tested before the Supreme Court. But I'm guessing that if he tries to pardon any of the people involved in this whole Ukraine scandal, that the first thing that'll happen is that the Democrats will sue him, and they'll sue him at the Supreme Court.
You're giving us a lot of great news today, Professor Hartmann.
Yeah, well, we'll see. We'll see. But that's frankly, that's my take. That's what I think is going to happen. Chaz, thanks a lot for the call. Gene in Myerstown, Pennsylvania. Hey, Gene, thanks for watching Free Speech TV. What's up?
I think that if the whistleblower hadn't come out within the next week or two, we would have had Zelensky go on CNN or wherever.
Oh, he was going to. Fareed Zakaria wrote a column for the Washington Post about 2 weeks ago, laying it all out. It was Fareed Zakaria's show that he was going to do it on, and they had already negotiated all the terms and everything, and it was going to happen a week after the whistleblower announcement came out, and it got canceled as soon as the whistleblower news hit the street.
Yeah, Tom, I think Zelensky's image as a reformer would have been ruined.
Yes.
People would have saw through it with all of these crazy conspiracies that he would have had to spout.
Well, and Gene, that's a really important point, is that what Donald Trump has done is he has trashed the reputation, or nearly trashed the reputation of reformist small d Democrats, people, politicians around the world who are trying to run on a reformist platform. And I think the impeachment of Trump will restore some of Zelensky's credibility, although he just, his foreign minister just came out a couple days ago and said, we didn't feel any pressure. There was no quid pro quo. So he's still desperate, that Trump's still in office for another year. He might be in office for another 5 years. And so Zelensky is hedging his bets. I understand that.
He's trying to corrupt this man.
Yeah. Trump Trump nearly succeeded in corrupting Zelensky, and perhaps did fully succeed. And that's, another whole tragedy, is that a country that is trying to move from being an oligarchy, very corrupt oligarchy, into being a democracy, has that blown up in their faces. Gene, excellent point. Thanks for the call. We'll be right back. It is 20 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program. Stick around. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. That he did it. And welcome back. Getting your thoughts on all these things. Dave in Federal Way, Washington, a former intelligence officer. If you're the same Dave, I think you are.
Yeah, I am, Tom. Hey, yesterday I drove from Hermiston, Oregon, back to Seattle with a guy who had a Trump 2020 hat on.
Uh-oh.
Very interesting. Yeah, it was a very interesting, long conversation. And this commentary that I guess Devin Nunes is doing about, Trump doesn't like foreign aid to begin with, that's all red meat for Trump's base, to keep Trump's base there. Trump just increased the amount that South Korea and Japan have to pay to the United States by 400%. Simultaneously, Kim Jong-un turned down Trump's offer for another summit. See,
right, and there's a third piece to that too, Dave, and that is that the South Koreans are in talks right now with the Chinese, and there's a big concern that they're going to stop depending, as it were, on the United States for military assistance and go to China.
Yeah, and this is kind of why I like talking to you about this, because I think you actually understand the Trump voter perspective on this. But the thing is they're not getting the big picture, but I think you do get it when you mentioned that right now, as we speak, Israel is bombing the bejesus out of Syria.
Right.
If we do not give aid, if we just go completely isolationist and focus on harassing minorities and veterans and whatever Trump voters like to do, then when these wars go hot, all right, they are going to have to send their sons and daughters to fight them. All right, there's only so long that Israel and Saudi Arabia are going to allow Iran and Russian soldiers and Turkish soldiers to dominate that region.
Right, especially Syria, where Russia has a major military base.
Yes, and the reason why I mentioned Syria and Israel is because this all harkens back to the Great Game period, when Imperial Russia was defeated by Japan. Saudi Arabia and Israel together could evict. They could evict all those Russians. They could evict all those Turks. I mean, they have the technology, the money. Yes, from the region. And if not, Russia could face another embarrassing defeat, which would, just like they did against Japan, and this could throw the world into turmoil. I mean, this is some serious stuff.
Yeah, what people don't get is that the whole idea of the Department of State and the United Nations, I mean, obviously the State Department is as old as the country, and our first Secretary of State, I believe, was Thomas Jefferson. But I'm pretty sure. In any case, the Department of State is an ancient thing, but using it in order, for the purposes of diplomacy and getting involved in a whole bunch of countries around the world where it doesn't seem like we have direct interests. The principal purpose of that, the reason that we so radically realigned our international relations after, in the 1930s, was because of World War I. And then after World War II, after World War I, you had Woodrow Wilson trying to create the League of Nations. The Republicans fought him, and finally it failed. And so then after World War II, they were like, okay, you can do the United Nations. We could have a UN, and Harry Truman brings us back. But it's just, I mean, it's all of the stuff that Trump is taking apart was put into place to prevent World War III.
Yes. Yeah, and Trump voters, they don't get it. Okay, this transactionalism, if that's what you want to call it, that Trump is engaged in, is only going to cause the loss of life of a lot of people that are going to die prematurely. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. I don't mean to be overly dramatic, but that's exactly where this is going.
If you are the parent of a young man between the ages of 18 and 23, more or less, if my recollection is correct, or maybe it's 17 and 23, then you should be thinking real seriously about what happens if the world descends into World War III and the United States has to institute a draft to create a large enough army. And perhaps a young woman of that age, too. I mean, you know, now that women are allowed in combat, the draft could extend to women as well.
Well, yeah, exactly. And you know, that Trump voter I drove back with, he kept saying, well, America's weak. I'm like, no, I don't think you understand what weakness is. A draft would be a significant emotional event in America right now.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? That's, I mean, you know, we are not accustomed to that, all right? Russia is not Baghdadi. Russia is not ISIS, okay?
Right.
No matter how much you want to pretend they are, Russia can put is a very lethal adversary, all right?
Yeah, they could drop a nuke on New York.
Well, there's no way we're going to go against Russia without a draft. That's all there is to it.
There you go. There you go. Dave, thank you for the call. Yeah, and they've got, you know, a massive army and a very, very competent military apparatus, and they are no dummies. I mean, you know, Russia defeated, we like to take credit for defeating Hitler during World War II, but had Russia not jumped into the battle, into the fray, we would not have won. Hitler would have won. We'll be back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
So what do you think happened this morning, and where do you think this is going? I think this was the John Dean moment. I think this was the turning point. It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from the Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study by Stefano Harney and Fred Moten. This is from the introduction. It starts with love, exchange, fellowship. It ends as it begins, in motion, in between various modes of being and belonging, and on the way to new economies of giving, taking, being with and for. And it ends with a ride in a Buick Skylark on a way to another place altogether. Surprising, perhaps, after we have engaged dispossession, debt, dislocation, and violence, but not surprising when you have understood that the projects of fugitive planning and black study are mostly about reaching out to find connection. They are about making common cause with the brokenness of being, a brokenness, I would venture to say, that is also blackness, that remains blackness, and will, despite all, remain broken, because this book is not a prescription for repair. If we do not seek to fix what has been broken, then what? How do we resolve to live with brokenness, with being broke, which is also what Moten and Harney called debt? Well, given that debt is sometimes a history of giving, at other times a history of taking, at all times a history of capitalism, and given that debt also signifies a promise of ownership but never delivers on that promise, we have to understand that debt is something that cannot be paid off. Debt, as Harney puts it, presumes a kind of individualized realization to a naturalized economy that is predicated upon exploitation. Can we have, he asks, another sense of what is owed that does not presume a nexus of activities like recognition and acknowledgement, payment and gratitude? Can debt become a principle of elaboration? Moten links economic debt to the brokenness of being in the interview with Stefan Shukatis, who he acknowledges that some debts should be paid and that much is owed, especially to black people, by white people. And yet he says, I also know that it is, that what it is that is supposed to be repaired is irreparable. It can't be repaired. The only thing we can do is tear this stuff down completely and build something new, end of quote. The Undercommons do not come to pay their debts, to repair what has been broken, to fix what has been undone. If you want to know what the Undercommons wants, what Moten and Harney want, what black people, indigenous people, queers, and poor people want, what we, the we who cohabit in the space of the Undercommons want, it is this. We cannot be satisfied with the recognition and acknowledgement generated by the very system that denies A, that anything was ever broken, and B, that we deserve to be the broken part. So we refuse to ask for recognition, and instead we want to take apart, dismantle, tear down that structure right now. That right now limits our ability to find each other, to see beyond it, and to access the places that we know live outside its walls. We cannot say what new structures will replace the ones we live with yet, because once we have torn stuff down, we will inevitably see more and see differently and feel a new sense of wanting and being and becoming. What we want after the break will be different from what we think we want before the break, and both are necessarily different from the desires that issue from being in the dark. Let's come at this by another path. In the melancholic and visionary 2009 film version of Maurice Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are, 1963, Max, the small seeker who leaves his room, his home, his family to find the world beyond, finds a world of lost and lonely beasts, and they promptly make him their king. Max is the first king the wild things have had, whom they did not eat, and who did not, in turn, try to eat them. And the beasts are the first grown things that Max has met, who want his opinion, his judgment, and his rule. Max's power is that he is small while they are big. He promises the beasts that he has no plans to eat them, and that this is more than anyone has ever promised them. He promises them that he will find ways through and around and will slip through the cracks and re-crack the cracks if they fill up. He promises to keep sadness at bay and to make the world with the wild creatures that roared their terrible roars and gnashed their terrible teeth and rolled their terrible eyes and showed their terrible claws. That Max fails to make the wild things happy or to save them or to make the world with them is less important than the fact that he found them and he recognized in them the end of something and potentially the path to an alternative in his world, or an alternative to his world, excuse me. The wild things were not the utopian creatures of fairy tales. They were the rejected and lost subjects of the world Max had left behind. And because he shuttles between the Oedipal land where his mother rules and the ruined world of the wild, he knows the parameters of the real. He sees what is included and what is left out. And he is now able to set sail for another place, a place that is neither the home he left nor the home to which he wants to return. Moten and Harney want to gesture to another place, a wild place that is not simply the leftover space that limbs real and regulated zones of polite society. Rather, it is a wild place that continuously produces its own unregulated wilderness. The zone we enter through Moten and Harney is ongoing and exists in the present, and as Harney puts it, some kind of demand is already being enacted, fulfilled in the call itself. While describing the riots of London in 2011, Harney suggests that the riots and insurrections do not separate out the request, the demand, and the call. Rather, they enact the one in the other. The book is The Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study. Welcome back. Gordon Sondland testifying today. The hearing's going to be coming back together in the next 2 or 3 minutes. So as soon as it does, we'll go right back to it. Meantime, Pete in Santa Cruz, California. Your thoughts, Pete?
Yeah, this whole thing is, if you wrap it up, it fits the definition of a RICO operation. And
I agree. Racketeering influenced organized crime, yep.
And corrupt organization.
Corrupt organization, thank you, yeah.
All of them, the whole gang should be rounded up and thrown away. All the way back to the GSA, the person who was placed at GSA to approve the hotel for him.
Yeah, yes, absolutely, because the lease says that if the leaseholder, this is the old post office building in D.C., if the leaseholder becomes an elected official, that they have to release the lease, which I think is probably one of the reasons why Trump is trying to sell that hotel. Pete, excellent. Thank you. Steve in Phoenix, Arizona. Your thoughts, Steve?
Hey, Tom. I'll try to be as quick as I can. One thing is, you think Gordon Sondland is sorry he donated the $1 million to the Trump campaign?
I don't know. He's now a very famous guy, and that seems to be something that he craved was, fame and recognition. Everybody knows his name now. So if he doesn't go to jail, I suspect he'll be still think it was a good investment.
It could be. All the worries, of the World War III and stuff have been brought to us by this monster.
Yeah.
And by Fox News and the Murdoch, cancer.
And right-wing hate radio. Yep.
You betcha. David, in the intelligence community, he is really great with his insights and stuff. We really appreciate it. And one other thing, when are the people in the military going to finally wake up, and the veterans, to that the Republican Party, they're just horrible for them, and personally bad for America. And lastly is, it's funny how Giuliani, we'll call him Giuliani, used to fight RICO stuff. Now he is a RICO. Thanks, Tom.
There you go. Well said. Thank you, Steve. Zoe in Louisville, Kentucky. Hey, Zoe, what's up?
Hi, Tom. Well, I was just thinking that the Rubes are definitely going to pick up on that little bit that the Republican lawyer floated at one point when he was talking with the ambassador. He said that maybe, the president was withholding aid to the Ukraine because the president wanted to be a careful steward to U.S. taxpayer money.
Right. Yeah, there you go.
That wouldn't be a revelation. That would be a friggin' miracle.
Yes.
I laughed so loud I scared my dogs, my neighbor's dogs. It was ridiculous.
Yeah. Donald Trump, who has spent hundreds of millions of dollars golfing, of our taxpayer dollars golfing at properties, his own properties around the world.
And the bankruptcy.
Right. Yeah. He's just trying to save us some money. Yeah. Right.
He's just trying to save us a nickel or two.
Oh, it's incredible. Zoe, thank you. Thank you for the call. Well said. Mia in Baltimore, Maryland. Hey, Mia.
Hey there. Thanks, Tom, for having me on the show.
Sure.
What we've heard is jaw dropping. I mean, they presented the emails. They showed the WhatsApp. They told us who was looped in. And then the day before, they simply told us that it was recorded.
Yeah.
And as a candidate for Congress here in Maryland, I have to say, release those tapes.
Amen.
It is going to be vital to
Mia, what's your website?
MiaBMason.us.
Great. Thank you. Mia, I agree with you. Release the tapes because the Republicans are still stonewalling the committee. Richie in Boston. Hey, Richie, what's up?
Hello, sir. How are you? First-time caller?
Thank you. I'm great. What's on your mind?
I just caught your program last week, and I think it's been awesome. I wanted to share that I believe the Republicans and all their cronies who have been involved in this are going down. It's not just Trump going down. I believe Pence is going down. I believe Giuliani is going down. And all those who are corrupt and have been following this government are aid and abetting as well are going down.
Amen. From your lips to God's ears, Richie. My guess is, though, that what's going to happen is Giuliani's going to go to jail, just like Michael Cohen did. Because Trump basically has always, I'm sure, throughout his whole entire life, well, in fact, we know it's a matter of documentary evidence that he's always had a fixer, a lawyer who would do his dirty work for him. First, it was Roy Cohn throughout most of his life, and then he replaced Roy Cohn with Michael Cohen, and C-O-H-E-N instead of C-O-H-N, although Michael Cohen started pronouncing his last name Michael Cohn just to please Donald Trump, and then Michael Cohen goes down, and he gets replaced with Rudy Giuliani, and now Giuliani's going to go down. The question is, how many people does Giuliani take with him? His deleting that tweet this morning where he was protesting his innocence, I think, is actually a pretty big deal. It's going to be real interesting to see what Gymnasium Jordan has to say about all this and whether Devin Nunes is going to sue another imaginary cow. Thanks a lot for the call, Richie. Carol in Monessen, Pennsylvania. Hey, Carol, what's up?
Hey, Tom.
Sondland's going into the room right now, by the way.
And I think Sondland gave me a wonderful birthday
Well, happy
present.
birthday, Carol. Happy birthday.
Thank you. I think he threw a bomb into the White House today. Which is what I've been waiting for.
Yeah, it's certainly a metaphorical bomb. Yes, absolutely. It certainly seems that way. Thanks a lot for the call. Ben in Hood River, Oregon. Ben, got a quick one here? Sondland just sat down in his chair, so it'll probably be another minute or two.
Yeah, hi, Tom. Thanks for taking my call. I only recently discovered your program. It was your segment on the arrest of Ulysses S. Grant that I heard. That was my first exposure to the program, and I thought that was just fantastic.
And what's so ironic is he was arrested by an African-American police officer who had fought for the Union.
A war veteran, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering when somebody is going to walk in there, put handcuffs on Trump and walk his butt right out of there. And, we have a whole prison industrial complex set up in this country. And find it strange that we can't find space for Donald Trump.
Yeah. Well, the problem right there is Bill Barr. But Bill Barr is, marinating in his own juices pretty badly right now. So we'll see where all this goes. It looks like... well, no, they haven't started yet. So let's hear from Corky. And thank you for the call, Ben. Corky in Rochester, New York. Quick one, Corky.
Hello, Tom. Yeah, just Sondland swept everybody up.
Yeah. Yeah, he really did. He said, "How can you say that we were the outside track, or the whatever the phrase was, when you had the Secretary of State in on this, you had the Secretary of Energy in on this, Pompeo and Perry, you had the President in on this, you had the President's personal lawyer in on this. I mean, this was okay. The hearings are starting again. So Corky, thanks a lot for the call, and we're going to go back to Adam Schiff.
Recognize myself for 5 minutes. First of all, I wanted to clarify something for the record. With respect to the witness who testified on Saturday, that is Mr. Sandy. He is a career official with the Office of Management and Budget. He is today reviewing his transcript, an opportunity we give all the witnesses before their transcript is released to make sure that it's accurate and correct. As his deposition was only taken on Saturday, this was the soonest we could arrange that.
That's the guy that Devin Nunes said, "There's nothing to see here."
If they wish to use any of the questioning from Mr. Sandy's deposition, they could do so, and we would happily take whatever excerpts they needed even prior to the witness having the chance to go through it. They chose not to take advantage of that opportunity.
So Schiff here is calling Nunes' bluff.
Point, which is, he is not the top official at the Office of Management and Budget responsible for releasing foreign assistance. Those individuals are named Vaught and Duffy. And both of those political appointees have been subpoenaed to testify, and both of those political appointees have refused. In fact, as the deposition will make clear when the transcript is released, at a certain point, Mr. Sandy was taken out of at least one significant part of the process. But that transcript will be made available as soon as he finishes the review, and we can redact any personal information from it. I want to ask you just a few questions, and our staff, because the expanded round, had time to get through much of what I wanted to ask you, Ambassador. But with respect to the statement, you were going back, and I mean by you and others, Ambassador Volker and others, were going back and forth with the Ukrainians to figure out what statement they would have to make to get the meeting, correct?
Correct.
And they understood they were going to have to make this statement publicly in order to get the meeting?
Correct.
Similarly, you testified that pretty much everyone could put 2 and 2 together and make 4, and understood that the military assistance was also conditioned on the public announcement of these 2 investigations, correct?
That was my presumption, yeah.
You put 2 and 2 together and you got 4. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, you're capable of putting 2 and 2 together, and so are the Ukrainians. They can put 2 and 2 together as well. They understood there was a hold on security assistance. There's testimony that they understood that in July or August, but it was without a doubt understood when it was made public in the newspaper. They understood that the security assistance was being held up, right?
I don't know when they understood it, but presumably they did.
Well, certainly once it was public, they understood the security assistance was withheld, right?
Once it was public, I assume so, yes.
And indeed, that was one of the issues that was brought up in that meeting between Zelensky and Pence in Warsaw.
I think, as I testified previously, Chairman, I think Zelensky, if I recall, asked the question more open-ended, like, when do we get our money?
Well, okay. So they understood they didn't have the money yet. It had been approved by Congress. There was a hold on it. Yep. You couldn't give them any explanation.
I couldn't.
Is that right?
That's right.
They asked, you couldn't tell them why it was being withheld, right?
I could not.
And if they couldn't put 2 and 2 together, you put 2 and 2 together for them, because you told them in Warsaw they were going to need to make that public statement likely to get that aid released. Is that right?
I said I presume that might have to be done in order to get the aid released.
Because we've had a lot of argumentation here. Well, the Ukrainians didn't know the aid was withheld, but the Ukrainians found out, and then it was made abundantly clear, if they hadn't put 2 and 2 together themselves, that if they wanted that aid, they were going to have to make these statements, correct?
Correct.
Mr. Nunes.
Yield to Mr. Ratcliffe.
Ambassador Sondland, I'm going to try and quickly move to summarize all of your direct communications with President Trump as it relates to this inquiry, and of course you can correct me if I get it wrong. On May 23rd, you had a group meeting.
This is
that included,
Ratcliffe,
what you
the
called a vanilla
Republican,
request
one of the more
about,
effective
ending
Republican
corruption
questioners.
involving Ukrainian oligarchs, correct?
Correct.
On July 25th, you called President Trump to say you were on your way to Ukraine, but nothing of substance occurred on that call, correct?
Correct.
Where he's going
July
with this is
26th,
Trump
you had a
never
5-minute
said to
call at a
you, you
restaurant
must do
that
this.
You didn't originally remember because it, according to your statement this morning, quote, did not strike me as significant at the time, end quote, but once refreshed, recalled that the primary purpose was a rapper named ASAP Rocky, correct?
Correct.
And on September 9th, and most importantly, reading from your deposition, you called President Trump to ask him, what do you want from Ukraine? He responded, I want nothing. I want no quid pro quo. I want Zelensky to do the right thing. I want him to do what he ran on. And what he ran on was fighting corruption, correct?
Correct.
And then lastly, on October 2nd, in a random in-person meeting that you had at an event for the Finnish president, you ran into President Trump and advised him that you'd been called to testify before Congress, and he said to you, good, go tell the truth.
That's correct.
All right, and that is the entirety of your recollection of your direct communications with President Trump about these matters.
I may have had another call or meeting or two.
See, mob bosses never just say this stuff out loud.
I understand, but this
You
is
know,
what you
they don't say, go kill that guy. They say stuff like, well,
Tell me if there's
no
anything
one
sinister
rid me of
or
this
nefarious
meddlesome
in any of
priest.
this. A vanilla request about corruption, a call to say I'm on my way to Ukraine, a 5-minute call you didn't remember as significant, but the primary purpose was to discuss a rapper, a call that you made where the president said, I want nothing, I want no quid pro quo, I want Zelensky to do the right thing, I want him to do what he ran on, and him telling you to go tell Congress the truth. Anything sinister or nefarious about any of that?
Not the way you present it.
Okay, and that is the truth as you've presented it, correct?
Correct.
All right, why that's important, Ambassador Sondland, is because none of that is hearsay. None of that is speculation. None of that is opinion. That is direct evidence. And ultimately, that is what, if this proceeds to the Senate, they're going to care about. Unlike this proceeding, which has been based on largely speculation and presumption and opinion.
See, this is, you can see where he's going, where Ratcliffe is going with this.
Evidence.
In other words, Trump never came right out and said, you know, you got to do this. And therefore, there's no there. He's going to continue going down this road. This is, you know, because Sondland said, oh, I finally figured it out.
So going back to the July
out in the public.
26th
We'll be
call,
back. It's 48 minutes past the hour.
It's going to be a spectacle tomorrow. You didn't remember it because it didn't
You're
strike
listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Republican Congressman Ratcliffe is questioning Ambassador Sondland right now.
All right, and if that call was part of a bribery or extortion scheme that you were part of, as Democrats have alleged, you'd remember that as significant, wouldn't you?
I was not a part, and I would have.
I understand that, and I agree with you. Let's turn to the quid pro quo, because it's been reported in the papers that this was blockbuster testimony today about quid pro quo and new evidence. To be fair to you, Ambassador Sondland, according to your statement today, as you say on page 14, as you testified previously, this was your opinion that there was a quid pro quo, correct?
The 2016 Burisma and the 2016 election and Burisma in return for the White House meeting. That's correct.
So you've shared that before. To that point, to be clear again, on the part of it that relates to military assistance, though, you don't have any direct evidence from President Trump about that part of it. That's your 2 + 2 part of the equation, right? The presumption.
Mob boss never said anything to you, did he?
All right. And you understand also that others disagreed. Yesterday we heard from Mr. Morrison, Ambassador Volker. They testified that they didn't see a quid pro quo. Do you understand that?
I understand that. That's what they said.
That reasonable people could look at all of this and come to different conclusions. Correct?
Correct.
I yield back.
Mr. Himes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, thank you for testifying. Ambassador, a couple
This is
things
Congressman Jim Himes. He's good.
In your opening
Democrat.
statement, you say Mr. Giuliani demanded that Ukraine make a public statement announcing investigations of the 2016 election DNC server in Burisma. Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desires of the President of the United States, and we knew that these investigations were important to the President. That last sentence is interesting. No conditionality, no modifiers. Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desires of the President of the United States. Mr. Giuliani communicates in colorful and memorable terms. What did Mr. Giuliani say to you that caused you to say that he is expressing the desires of the President of the United States?
Mr. Himes, when that was originally communicated, that was before I was in touch with Mr. Giuliani directly. So this all came through Mr. Volker and others.
So Mr. Volker told you that he was expressing the desires of the President of the United States?
Correct.
And subsequently, when you saw the transcript of the July 25th conversation with President Zelensky, you put it all together, and yeah, this is the desire of the President of the United States.
After I saw the July 25th reading.
Right, okay. Other thing that is interesting here, the theme of your testimony today is that everybody knew and signed off, which is a little different from what we've heard, right? We've heard this from others saying that your effort out there was irregular, it was shadow foreign policy, characterized as a drug deal. And by the way, that was not a Democratic characterization, despite what Mr. Nunes says. That, of course, was the National Security Advisor of the United States characterizing it as a drug deal. What confuses me is that you have said and testified, and it's in here, that the Secretary of State was not only aware, but that he applauded you. Good work. Keep banging away. The Secretary of State, if this had been irregular or a drug deal or a shadow foreign policy, he would have been the one to put an end to it, and yet he did not, right?
Well, the Secretary of State, I think, was taking into account the totality of what I've been working on, globally, and saying, you're doing a great job, including this.
Right, okay, so he was aware of what you were doing, and you're doing a great job, includes this.
Yes.
So in some sense, he was validating it rather than saying this was irregular or shadow or a drug deal.
We never thought it was irregular. We thought it was in the center lane.
And why do you think the Secretary of State thought that?
Why did he think?
Why did he think that this was a worthy thing to do when so many senior people, including the National Security Advisor, thought it was a drug deal?
I don't know. You'd have to ask him.
Okay. To your knowledge, did he have communications with the President about this?
I have no knowledge of this.
Haven't disputed Mr. Holmes's characterization of that report, although perhaps the mention of Biden, you don't recall that. I'm actually pretty confident we'll get a transcript of that call. A conversation in public between a high-profile ambassador and the President of the United States will be the top target, not for one, but for many foreign intelligence services. And because it's pretty sensitive stuff to this inquiry, and pretty sensitive stuff because this information could be used to embarrass the president or leverage public officials, my guess is we're going to see the transcript. Our people are pretty good, and if other people have it, we're going to see this transcript. Until then, all we've got is your recollection and the testimony of the other people there. So I'm curious about your frame of mind. This statement, the Ambassador Sondland agreed that the president did not give a fig, not the word used, about Ukraine. Is that a statement you might make? Do you believe that the president doesn't give a fig about Ukraine?
Are you, Congressman, are you referring to the call, or are you referring
to my conversation? Democrat of Connecticut Jim Himes questioning Ambassador Sondland.
And I'll read it to you. Ambassador Sondland agreed that the president did not give a fig about Ukraine. Fig was not the word used there. And I'm asking you whether it's plausible that he might have heard that, because I'm asking you whether you believe that the president does not give a fig about Ukraine.
I think that's too strong. I think that based on the May 23rd meeting, the president was down on Ukraine for the reasons mentioned and would need a lot of convincing, and that's why we're pushing so hard for the meeting between the president and President Zelensky, because we thought once the two of them would meet, his impression of Ukraine, his stock about Ukraine would go up.
And what about this line? And Ambassador Sondland replied that he meant, quote unquote, big stuff that benefits the president. That's what you meant by big stuff. So again, we don't have the transcript. I suspect we will. But is that something you might say? Do you believe that the president really considers big stuff to be that which benefits him?
I don't recall saying benefits him.
No, I understand that. I'm not asking what you recalled. I'm asking whether it's plausible that you might have said that because you believe, I'm asking you what you believe right now, that the president doesn't give a fig about Ukraine, and in fact cares about the big stuff that benefits the president. Do you believe that now?
I really can't opine.
Wait, I'm not asking for your opinion. I'm asking for your beliefs.
This is getting
I
interesting.
don't understand your question. I want to answer your question. I just don't understand.
Let me try one more time.
Okay.
He's basically saying, do you think the president is corrupt?
What is alleged that you said on this phone call, that the president cares primarily about stuff, the big stuff that benefits the president? Is that a belief?
The president said that on the phone call. I don't think the president said that to me on the phone.
And Sondland doesn't want to just stick the knife in the back here.
Talking about ASAP Rocky, and he mentioned investigations. I don't know why you're.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Mr. Conaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield 6 minutes to Mr. Jordan.
And here comes Gymnasium Jordan.
Ambassador, when did it happen?
When did what happen?
The announcement. When did President Zelensky announce that the investigation was going to happen? On page 14, you said this: was there a quid pro quo? Your opening statement. As I testified previously, with regard to a requested White House call, White House meeting, the answer is yes, that there needed to be a public statement from President Zelensky. When the chairman asked you about the security
Gymnasium Jordan has had his Adderall today.
A public announcement from Zelensky. So I'm asking you a simple question. When did that happen?
Never did.
Never did. They got the call July 25th. They got the meeting, not in the White House, but in New York on September 25th. They got the money on September 11th. When did the meeting happen again?
Never did.
Good old Gymnasium Jordan. You can always count on him.
The meeting that never happened.
Anyhow, we'll be back with the hearings. Ambassador Sondland is being right now harassed by Gymnasium Jordan.
You know how Zelensky announced it? Did he tweet it? Did he do a press statement? Did he do a press conference? You know how that happened? I mean, you got all
You're
three of them
listening
wrong.
to Thom Hartmann.
They get the call, they get the meeting, they get the money. It's not 2 + 2, it's 0 for 3. I mean, I've never seen anything like this. And you told Mr. Castor that the president never told you that the announcement had to happen to get anything. In fact, he didn't just not tell you that, he explicitly said the opposite. The gentleman from Texas just read it. You said to the President of the United States, what do you want from Ukraine? The President, I want nothing. I want no quid pro quo. I want Zelensky to do the right thing. I want him to do what he ran on. What did he run on, Ambassador Sondland?
Transparency.
And dealing with corruption, right?
That's right.
Mr. Castor raised another important point. Why didn't you put that statement in your opening statement? I think you said you couldn't fit it in. Is that right? Said we might be here for 46 minutes instead of 45 minutes.
It wasn't purposeful, trust me.
Wasn't purposeful?
No.
Couldn't fit it in a 23-page opener. The most important statement about the subject matter at hand, the President of the United States in a direct conversation with you about the issue at hand, and the President says, let me read it one more time. What do you want from Ukraine, Mr. President? I want nothing. I want no quid pro quo. I want this new guy, brand new guy in politics. His party just took over. I want Zelensky to do the right thing. I want him to run on and do what he ran on, which is deal with corruption. And you can't find time to fit that in a 23-page opening statement. You know what a quid pro quo is?
I do.
This for that, right? Looks to me like Ukraine got that 3 times, and there was no this. We didn't do anything. Or excuse me, they didn't have to do anything. I've never seen anything like that. And this is, when the call came out, you all remember this? When the call came out, everyone said, we're going to quid pro quo. There's going to be that was what was in the call. And of course, that didn't happen. That didn't happen. Remember what the complaint said? Remember what the memo said of the whistleblower? This call was frightening. This call was scary. All those things. None of that materialized. None of that materialized. I yield back.
Ms. Sewell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to dig a little deeper in this quid pro quo. Did you not say in your opening
This is
statement
Democrat
and
Terry
in
Sewell
previous
from,
testimony in closed
I believe,
door hearing
Alabama, yeah.
that you thought there was a quid pro quo?
I thought the quid pro quo was the White House visit in return for the 2016 DNC server and Burisma investigation.
So when you heard Burisma, you did not see that as code for Biden, the Bidens?
I did not.
When did you even know that? Is your testimony that you only realized that Burisma included the Bidens when the readout came out in September 25th?
No, my testimony wasn't specific as to the date because I really don't recall the date. It was very late in the game, though.
September?
I don't recall the date.
So if I told you that the legal definition of bribery was an event of offering, giving, soliciting, or receiving of any item of value as a means of influencing an action of an individual holding a public or legal duty, do you believe that not only was it quid pro quo, but it was bribery?
I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not going to characterize what something was or wasn't legally.
You also said in your opening statement that Secretary Perry and yourself, as well as Ambassador Volker, worked with Giuliani on the Ukraine matter as an express direction of the president. Is that right?
That's correct.
You also go on to say that we did not want to work with Giuliani. Simply put, we played the hand that we were dealt. What did you mean by that? And more importantly, what did you think would happen if you did not play that hand?
I think what you're asking me is, well, you asked it.
I did ask
it. What would happen if we didn't? It was very fragile with Ukraine at the time. There was no new ambassador. The old ambassador had left. There was a new president, and we thought it was very, very important to shore up the relationship.
In fact, you actually said, you go on to say, we all understood that if we refused to work with Mr. Giuliani, we would lose an important opportunity to cement relationships with the United States and Ukraine. So quote, we followed the president's orders. Did you see it as a directive?
I saw it as the only pathway to moving forward on Ukraine.
So you would say that the efforts that Mr. Giuliani was undertaking became a part of the formal Ukraine-U.S. policy?
I can't opine on that. All I can tell you is the president wanted us to communicate with Mr. Giuliani.
But you went on to say that you, in your opening testimony, that the suggestion that you engaged in some, quote, irregular or rogue diplomacy is absolutely false. So if in fact what Giuliani was doing was okay and proper, which is actually what you said, initially you all thought that what he was doing was not improper, right?
We did not think it was improper, and when I referred to the fact that I was not engaging in rogue diplomacy, by definition, rogue diplomacy would have meant I would not have involved the leadership of the State Department and the White House.
So you're saying that everyone in the chain of command knew about Giuliani's efforts to try to get the investigations into Burisma and to, so I'm just trying to figure out what you thought you were actually opining to.
Look, the president directed us to work with Mr. Giuliani, and the leadership of the State Department were knowledgeable, as was the NSC, that we were working with Mr. Giuliani.
Well, what's interesting is that Ambassador Taylor testified that he knew nothing about it, and clearly he would be in the chain of information if he was the ambassador to Ukraine. At the end of the day, sir, with all due respect, you're the ambassador to the European Union. Why would he not know about it?
I don't know.
He was the one who said that there was both a regular and irregular channel.
He should have known about it.
So although we don't want, although you said that you did not want to work with Mr. Giuliani, you in fact did work with him.
That's correct.
And do you think that the essence of what he was trying to achieve was accomplished?
I don't know what he was trying to achieve.
You clearly had to have known, sir. If you think that this was actually going down the center lane, is what you said, it was clearly important that we work with Mr. Giuliani to get what the president asked for because it was a directive and an order. Surely you must know whether or not mission was accomplished.
Well, I know what Mr. Giuliani communicated to us.
And you thought that that was totally fine? Did you really think that it was okay for...
Can I answer your question?
Sure.
You asked what Mr. Giuliani was trying to achieve.
No, I asked whether you thought that it was right for Mr. Giuliani to want to accomplish the efforts that he was involved in, which was to get them to investigate Burisma and the 2016 election, as you said?
All I can testify to is what I know that Mr. Giuliani either told me directly or told Ambassador Volker and others that was relayed to me.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Turner.
Ambassador Sondland, I want to walk through some of the portions of your testimony.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
So Donald Trump finally speaks. Well, he did read some notes to reporters a little bit ago. He just tweeted, "Impeachment witch hunt is now over," all caps. Ambassador Sondland asked U.S. President, parenthesis, me, quote, "What do you want from Ukraine? I keep hearing all these different ideas and theories. What do you want?" It was a very abrupt conversation. He was not in a good mood. He, the president, just said, "Impeachment witch hunt just said, I want nothing. I want nothing. I want no quid pro quo. Tell President Zelensky to do the right thing," close quote. Later, Ambassador Sondland said that I told him, "Good, go get the truth. This witch," and then now in Trump's voice in his tweet, "This witch hunt must end now. So bad for our country." So that's where we're at right this moment. And now Republican Mike Turner of Ohio is questioning Ambassador Sondland.
The Burisma in 2016. That was very clear to Ambassador Volker.
And how do you know that? What did he say to you? Because he says that was not clear to him. In fact, he says that's not the case. He was working on that. He knows that that's what the president wanted, but he didn't have it as this was a requirement.
Oh, I strongly disagree with that portion of his testimony. It was absolutely a requirement, or we would have just had the meeting and been done with it.
What about the aid? He says that they weren't tied, that the aid was not tied.
And I didn't say they were conclusively tied either. I said I was presuming it.
Okay, and so the president never told you they were tied. So your testimony, his testimony is consistent, and the president did not tie aid to investigations.
That's correct.
Okay, he also testified that he spoke to Giuliani and that Giuliani did not relate that he was tying on behalf of the president or on the president's behalf aid, and then in fact, Giuliani never said to him that aid was tied to investigations. Now, the question I have for you is, did you ever have a conversation with Giuliani that did not involve Volker? Because your testimony is a lot of we's and us's. So do you and Giuliani have a separate conference, separate phone call where Giuliani told you that the aid was tied? Because Volker says, and if he was on all your phone calls, Volker says that never happened.
No, I did have a few conversations. I don't recall how many because I don't have the records with Mr. Giuliani directly.
Because the White House won't release them.
Available.
And did Giuliani say to you, go ahead, what were you going to say?
I don't believe I testified that Mr. Giuliani told me that aid was tied.
Oh, I think, see, this is part of the problem, Ambassador Sondland, and I just want to walk you through this, is you've said to us everyone was in the loop, and everyone knew. Now, hold on a second. I've listened to you today, as a lot of people, and not only are your answers somewhat circular, frequently you've contradicted yourself in your own answer. Now, the text messages and emails that you put up there, Kurt Volker walked us through, and he has a completely different understanding of what you were saying than what you're saying you were saying. So I'm a little confused as to how everyone's in the loop, because if Giuliani didn't give you any express statement, then it can't be that you believe this from Giuliani. Now, let me tell you right now, because is Donald Trump your friend?
No, we're not friends.
Okay. Do you like the president?
Yes.
Okay. Well, after you testified, Chairman Schiff ran out and gave a press conference and said he gets to impeach the President of the United States because of your testimony. And if you pull up CNN today, right now, their banner says Sondland ties Trump to withholding aid. Is that your testimony today, Ambassador Sondland, that you have evidence that Donald Trump tied the investigations to the aid? Because I don't think you're saying that.
I've said repeatedly, Congressman, I was presuming. I also said that President Trump.
So no one told you, not just the president. Giuliani didn't tell you. Mulvaney didn't tell you. Nobody, Pompeo didn't tell you. Nobody else on this planet told you that Donald Trump was tying.
See, this is what I predicted when he was making his statement.
These investigations.
He said,
is that correct?
2 + 2 = 4.
I think I already testified.
No, answer the question. Is it correct? No one on this planet told you that Donald Trump was tying this aid to the investigations? Because if your answer is yes, then the chairman's wrong and the headline on CNN is wrong. No one on this planet told you that President Trump was tying aid to investigations. Yes or no?
Yes.
So you really have no testimony today that ties President Trump to a scheme to withhold aid from Ukraine in exchange for these investigations?
Other than my own presumption.
Which is nothing. I mean, that's what I don't understand. So you know what hearsay evidence is, Ambassador? Hearsay is when I testify what someone else told me. Do you know what made-up testimony is? Made-up testimony is when I just presume it. I mean, you're just assuming all of these things, and then you're giving them the evidence that they're running out and doing press conferences, and CNN's headline is saying that you're saying the President of the United States should be impeached because he tied aid to investigations, and you don't know that, correct?
I never said the President of the United States should be impeached.
Nope, but you did. You have left people with the confusing impression that you were giving testimony that you did not. You do not have any evidence that the President of the United States was tied to withholding aid from Ukraine in exchange for investigations. I yield back.
So that's the Fox News clip
Thank
for
you,
the day.
Chairman. Ambassador Sondland, I really want to better understand Mr. Giuliani's role in carrying out the president's demand for investigations.
This is Andre Carson of Indiana
on May the 23rd,
for the Democrats.
Sir, during a meeting in the Oval Office to discuss the future of U.S.-Ukraine relations, President Trump told you and others to, quote, talk to Rudy. Do I have that right, sir?
Correct.
Mr. Ambassador, did you listen to the president and talk to Rudy, sir?
Did I talk to Rudy?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
What did you understand to be Mr. Giuliani's relationship with President Trump?
I understood he was the president's personal lawyer.
What did you believe to be Mr. Giuliani? What did you believe Mr. Giuliani was doing in Ukraine for President Trump, sir?
I don't know.
Ambassador Sondland, in August of this year, you and Ambassador Volker spoke with Mr. Giuliani about a draft statement to be issued by President Zelensky. During those discussions, it was Mr. Giuliani who suggested, in fact, insisted that the statement include specific language about Burisma. Correct, sir?
Correct.
And he insisted that the statement include the mention of the 2016 elections. And Mr. Volker transmitted this message to a top Ukrainian official, right, sir?
Correct.
Mr. Ambassador, and this statement was part of the deliverable that President Trump wanted, correct, sir?
Correct.
So the Democrats are trying to basically help Sondland say, yeah, it was a quid pro quo.
Official State Department policy, sir?
I never testified that we were pushing anyone to investigate the Bidens. I said Burisma.
You were involved in Ukrainian policy, right, sir?
I told you what my role was, which was quite limited and focused.
Was it your understanding, Mr. Ambassador, that Ukraine policy should involve investigations into Americans or debunk conspiracy theories about the 2016 election, sir?
What I testified was that in order to get President Zelensky a White House visit, Mr. Giuliani conveyed the notion that President Trump wanted these announcements to happen.
Of course it was not. It was a part of the president's political agenda, and it was done to benefit the president personally and politically. Were you following the president's orders, Mr. Ambassador?
I was following the president's direction to speak with Mr. Giuliani.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Just want to point out a couple things, Ambassador, in response to my colleagues. My colleagues seem to be under the impression that unless the president spoke the words, Ambassador Sondland, I am bribing the Ukrainian president, that there's no evidence of bribery. If he didn't say, Ambassador Sondland, I'm telling you I'm not going to give the aid unless they do this, that there's no evidence of a quid pro quo on military aid. But nonetheless, Ambassador, you've given us a lot of evidence of precisely that conditionality of both the White House meeting and the military assistance. You've told us, Ambassador, have you not, that you emailed the Secretary of State and said that if these investigations were announced, the new justice person was put in place, that the Ukrainians would be prepared to give the president what he wants, and that would break the logjam. You've testified and showed us documents about this, have you not, Ambassador?
I have.
And in your written statement, you say that the logjam you're referring to includes the logjam on security assistance, correct?
Correct, as my presumption.
Yes, and we also have seen, and you testified, that you have also seen Ambassador, or rather Acting Chief of Staff Mulvaney himself acknowledge that the military aid was withheld in part over the investigation into 2016 that you've talked about. You referenced that as well, correct?
Correct.
Now, they also seem to say that, well,
essentially trying to recover the narrative.
they got the money. The money may have been conditioned, but they got the money. Yes, they got caught. They got caught. Now, they still don't have the White House meeting. They made no statement. They got no meeting. The statement on the investigations was the condition to get the meeting. They didn't make the statement. They got no meeting. But they got caught. You're aware, aren't you, Ambassador, that 2 days before the aid was lifted, this inexplicable aid was lifted, Congress announced it was investigating this scheme. You're aware of that, aren't you, Ambassador?
I am now, yes.
Dr. Wenstrup.
Now,
Mr.
now
Chairman.
it goes to
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to
Republican.
address something, a claim that you made this morning, claiming that Republicans deny
It's
Russian
Brad
attempts to
Wenstrup of
influence
Ohio.
our elections. That is false, and you know it. In this committee, the Intel Committee, not the Impeachment Committee, but in this committee, time and time again, we all agreed that Russia has tried to influence American elections as far back as the Soviet Union. So I wish you would quit making that comment. Yesterday, we established with Mr. Volker something quite obvious. More than one country can try to influence our elections. See, Mr. Schiff, we didn't agree with your Russian collusion narrative, your DNC Clinton campaign coup attempt that occurred in conjunction with members of the FBI and DOJ and foreign sources, something that you have conveniently ignored as chairman of the Intelligence Committee, as you became the chairman of the Impeachment Committee. But in this process today, I'm interested in facts. I'm not a prosecutor or a defense attorney. I'm not an attorney like Mr. Turner. Ambassador Sondland, you honestly have used the words presumed, presumption, presuming, some form of the verb to presume repeatedly today. And today you said that was the problem, Mr. Goldman. No one ever told me the aid was tied to anything. I was presuming it was. You see, in mathematic fact, 2 + 2 does equal 4. But in reality, 2 presumptions plus 2 presumptions does not equal even 1.
See, this is back to Michael Cohen saying Trump will never just say it out loud. Mob bosses don't do that.
No.
You know, organized crime figures don't say, hey, go hit veto for me. They say, veto is such a pain in the butt. And everybody understands. And that's probably how Trump talked to Giuliani, too. We're continuing in just a moment.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
It's the testimony of EU Ambassador Sondland before the U.S. House Intelligence Committee, serving as an impeachment committee.
We all know what Pinocchios mean. The interpretation of that would be that, or 2 interpretations. The one that my colleagues on the other side would argue is that we're trying to protect the whistleblower. An equally valid and credible interpretation is that there's something to hide, and that this unlevel playing field that's been created by the chairman's insistence that there is a statutory right to anonymity maintains that unlevel playing field and the advantages that gives them. Now, the chairman also announces at every hearing that he will not tolerate, and I agree with him, any witness intimidation, any threats, or any issues of trying to bully a witness. Ambassador Sondland, have you, your family, or your businesses received any threats or reprisals or attempts to harm you in any way?
Many.
Could you give us an example or 2?
We have countless emails, apparently, to my wife. Our properties are being picketed and boycotted.
Let's explore that one. Our own colleague, Congressman Earl Blumenauer from Oregon, has in fact called for a boycott of your hotel chains or your hotels in Oregon. I'm assuming he believes that that will harm you to the point that you will then be bullied into doing whatever he wants done. Now, my colleagues and I know that using the word bully and Earl Blumenauer in the same sentence is a bit over the top. But nevertheless, he intended to harm you and your businesses. Is that what you would surmise?
That's my understanding.
And that the boycotts, his call for boycott gave rise to demonstrations in front of your hotels that made your customers have to weave in and out of the demonstrators to try to actually get into the hotels?
As I understand, they're going on as we speak.
Well, the words are better put by a couple of other Oregonians. Says Congressman Blumenauer's irresponsible attempt to hurt a homegrown business that supports hundreds of jobs in our local economy is just shameful and ought to be an outrage to all Oregonians. Some fellow named McDermott. And then a lady named Ellen Carmichael, who I believe works for you, said, "We are saddened to have our Congressman Earl Blumenauer call for a boycott that would put the livelihoods of thousands of his constituents in peril. The attack on our employees is unwarranted." And I couldn't agree more, Mr. Ambassador. Mr. Blumenauer should not be using the vast influences that we as members of Congress have to bully you and your businesses and to harm the hundreds or thousands of employees that operate in your business by trying to take business away from you, to force you into doing something that they wanted you to do, which is actually testify, and you've actually done that. But that's a shame for that. And I'm hopeful that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will join me in saying, Mr. Blumenauer, you really shouldn't be using your congressional influence to try to bully and threaten a witness before these proceedings. That is just wrong. I'm going to look forward to my colleague's response, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman.
Ms. Spear.
I was somewhat humored by your request that Mr. Blumenauer not bully to get something done when all we're talking about is the president bullying to get something he wants done. But having said that, I'd like to clarify one point about the whistleblower protection from the article that Mr. Conway just provided. The law reads, expressly restricts the Inspector General's office from disclosing whistleblowers' identities. It says, quote, the Inspector General shall not disclose the identity of the employee without the consent of the employee unless the Inspector General determines that such disclosure is unavoidable during the course of the investigation or the disclosure is made to an official of the Department of Justice responsible for determining whether a prosecution should be undertaken. Unquote. That appears to be the lone statutory restriction on disclosing a whistleblower's identity, applicable only to the Inspector General's office. He found no court rulings on whether whistleblowers have a right to anonymity under the ICWPA or related statutes. Vladeck said it is nonetheless a best practice to avoid disclosure of the Ukraine whistleblower's identity, given the concerns about retaliation. McCulloch said, we've stepped into bizarro land when senior policymakers are trying to yank a CIA employee into the public spotlight in retaliation for making a whistleblowing complaint, especially when they are credible threats to that employee's personal safety. And I don't know why our colleagues on the other side of the aisle...
Did you lady yield?
No, I'm afraid I only have 3 minutes and I have some other issues, but thank you.
Well, the end of the article does go through that and also says it's 3 Pinocchios in spite of that conversation.
Well, the President of the United States has 5 Pinocchios on a daily basis, so let's not go there. Ambassador Sondland, in your deposition, you lamented, quote, I was truly disappointed that the State Department prevented me at the last minute from testifying earlier on October 8th, 2019. But your issuance of a subpoena has supported my appearance here today, and I'm pleased to provide the following testimony. So it is clear that the White House, the State Department...
And we're back. This is Jackie Spear, the Democrat of California, questioning Mr. Sondland.
That's correct.
And since then, you have on numerous occasions during your opening statement today indicated that you have not been able to access documents in the State Department. Is that correct?
Correct.
So you have been hampered in your ability to provide testimony to this committee. Is that correct?
I've been hampered to provide completely accurate testimony without the benefit of those documents.
In terms of your conversations with the President of the United States, what percentage of your conversations were about Ukraine as compared to your other duties?
I don't recall.
Well, you've only had 6 conversations or 7 conversations with the President, you said. So
about Ukraine, I think.
So you've had many other conversations?
Oh, yeah, about completely unrelated matters.
So how many conversations with the President of the United States have you had?
Again, I don't want to give you a number because it's going to be wrong if I don't have the records.
Is it less than 20?
It's probably in that range.
All right. Would you say that delay in military aid and the lack of a meeting in the White House works to the benefit of Russia?
Repeat the question again, please.
Would you say that the delay in military aid to Ukraine and the reluctance to have a White House meeting has a benefit to Russia?
I think it could be looked that way, yes, looked at that way.
All right, I'm going to just speak very briefly about code. When Michael Cohen was before the Oversight Committee, he was asked, you suggest
she's
the
going where I
president
keep
sometimes
going.
communicates
Michael
his
Cohen.
wishes indirectly. For example, you say, quote, Mr. Trump did not directly tell me to lie to Congress. That's not how he operates. It would be different, he said, he doesn't give you questions. He doesn't give you orders. He speaks in code. And I understand the code because I've been around him for a decade. So do you think that the president was speaking in code when he would talk about wanting investigations?
I can't characterize how the president was speaking. Every conversation I've had with the president has been fairly direct and straightforward.
All right, with that I yield back.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous consent request.
Very interesting.
You may state your question.
The DOE responds to Ambassador Sondland's comments before the House Intelligence Committee attributable to the DOE Secretary of the Press Secretary. Ambassador Sondland's testimony today
This is one of the Republicans.
Kerry's interaction and with Rudy Giuliani and direction
Interesting.
the Secretary received from President Trump. As previously
We'll be right back.
stated,
It's coming up on 28
spoke
minutes
to Rudy
past the hour.
Giuliani only once at the President's request. No one else was on that call. At no point before, during, or after the phone call did the words Biden or Burisma ever come.
This is Chris Stewart of Utah, by the way.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
And when we come back from the break, I'll fill you in on what Chris Stewart is up to. Stick around.
The American people expect a lot of things out of politics. Arguments, protests, we certainly see that. Clash of principles and ideas. I think sometimes eventually they actually would like to see some compromise. But I think something they expect above everything else, fundamental, they expect that there is a sense of fairness about it. And I want to read part of a text I received from someone that I have tremendous respect for. Just a few hours ago, she wrote, "Crafting a story to hurt another human being can never be right. The means of destroying and hurting another individual just does not justify the end, and politics does not give anyone free pass to destroy other people." Now, you can say a lot about the treatment of President Trump over the last 3 years, but I think one thing you cannot argue is that it has been fair. There were those calling for his impeachment literally before he was inaugurated. For 2.5 years, we were told every single day he has betrayed our country. He is a Russian asset. He has committed treason. Accusations that we know now are not true, and for which we never have any evidence to support that. He was accused of obstruction, and now here we are actually impeaching the president over, well, first, quid pro quo, until we found out that didn't poll very well with focus groups, and then it was bribery, until virtually every witness before us who was asked a question said they had no evidence of bribery, and now it's extortion. And again, the American people expect some sense of fairness. So when Nancy Pelosi goes before she has seen a shred of evidence, and she announces the president has betrayed his oath of office, he has betrayed the American people, he betrayed national security, without seeing any evidence, again, the American people say, well, what is fair about that? So the question before us now is, again, extortion. That's the latest version of the charges against the president. I'm not an attorney. Extortion sounds pretty scary. It's kind of serious. I had to look it up, what it means. It means obtaining money or property by threat to a victim's property or loved ones. Mr. Ambassador, I'm going to read you a couple of quotes from President Zelensky and then ask you a question. First, from a Ukrainian press release, Donald Trump is convinced that the new Ukrainian government will be able to quickly improve the image of Ukraine. Complete investigation of corruption, which inhibited the interaction with Ukraine and the USA. Does that sound like President Zelensky is being bribed or extorted in that comment?
As I testified previously, I'm not a lawyer either, and I don't want to characterize any legal terms. I really don't.
That's fine. I think most people would read that and say, that doesn't sound like he's under severe pressure. He makes it very clear in his own words then. Ukrainian President Zelensky told reporters during a joint press conference with Donald Trump that he was not pressured by the U.S. president. Again, I was not pressured. He used another time, there was no blackmail. I would ask you, do you think he felt like he was being extorted by the president based on these comments?
I really think that's for the committee and the Congress to.
Well, you know what, Mr. Ambassador, it's really for the American people.
I agree.
And the American people aren't stupid. And the American people can hear that, and they can say, I don't think he was under duress. I don't think he was being extorted. I don't think there was an exchange of a bribe. And I would conclude with this last observation. It is common for our national policy to withhold aid for various reasons. You know that's true as an ambassador. Is that not true?
That's true.
It's frequent, isn't it, that we will withhold aid for various reasons.
That's correct.
It is a policy. I mean, for example, President Bush did it. He suspended military aid to 35 countries over their lack of support for the International Criminal Court. I'll bet that helped his political standing back home. But I don't remember anyone suggesting we should impeach him for it. President Trump did it last year with Afghanistan over corruption. We did it with Pakistan over much the same thing, and no one suggested that we impeach them for it. This is a common occurrence in international relations. It is hardly an impeachable offense.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, sir, for being here today. You know, there are things we can agree with our colleagues on, things we can disagree. I can agree that with my colleague that we should turn over all the documents should be turned over. Mr. Ambassador, I think you agree that it would have helped your testimony, helped you understood that the State Department, the White House hasn't turned over a single document. The White House won the President's April phone conversation, but millions more out there. So on that we can agree. On others we can disagree as to, particularly as it relates to the whistleblower. It distresses me because I begin to wonder about the motivations. In the final analysis, the way I look at this is if we were investigating an arson, you all would indict the person who pulled the fire alarm. That person's job is done, and we've seen the smoke and we've seen the fire. Whatever the whistleblower did doesn't change the president's actions, doesn't change the president's own words, which are in our testimony, are in our body of evidence. It doesn't change Mr. Mulvaney's own words. It doesn't change the body of evidence here. All it does is put this person at risk. Back to the documents and what you know, and clearly, Mr. Ambassador, you seem to have your memory jogged by documents. Let's talk about May 23rd and see if this one helps you. Senator Johnson, in referencing the May 23rd meeting in his letter, sir, says, I have no recollection of the president saying that during the meeting. It is entirely possible he did because I do not work for the president. If made, the comments simply did not register.
We're back. This is Mike Quigley of Illinois.
I also remember
talking,
Sondland
Democrat,
staying
talking
behind
to Mr.
to talk to the president as the rest of the delegation left the Oval Office. Sir, do you recall this later conversation and what you and the president discussed?
I do.
And what was that?
Just again recapping what it was, sort of a free-for-all conversation, and I wanted to tie down exactly what we agreed to do and what we didn't.
And in that subsequent, he reinforced, talk to Rudy. And
talk to Rudy. You guys should work on this.
Did he go into any more detail about what that meant?
No.
Just said, talk to Rudy.
It was a very short conversation.
And the second part, you said there was something besides just talk to Rudy?
Yeah, to reconfirm that the three of us would be working on the Ukraine file.
Yeah, and
so on.
Back to Rudy in this seemingly contradictory messages here. You now recall the prerequisite mentioned in the July 10th meeting, right? That when you were having this discussion, the first meeting in John Bolton's office, sir?
Yes.
That you referenced that there was a condition?
I believe someone else testified that I raised that, and I didn't dispute that testimony, that I said, it's my understanding that in order to get this visit done, there needs to be an announcement about I don't know if I said investigations or said specifically Burisma and
Sure, but in your opening, you mentioned at the very same time that apparently there was a meeting with Rudy Giuliani, and the message you got was underscored, very concerned about what Lutsenko told them, that according to RG, Rudy Giuliani, the Z-POTUS meeting will not happen, which is not conditioned. It's just not going to happen. Your understanding of the difference here?
I think what you're saying is this meeting I was talking about in my opening statement was apparently a meeting that Rudy Giuliani was having
at the same time.
At the same time in Ukraine.
Right.
Unbeknownst to us.
Right. But he's saying something different. He's saying it's not going to happen. There's no notice in here that it's conditioned in any way.
Well, that was Ambassador Volker's point. This was really an exchange with Ambassador Taylor and Ambassador Volker. Ambassador Volker is saying, don't let other people speak for the U.S. government. That was his point.
But if Rudy is following the directions and he's saying what he's saying here, and you're also following directions, right? And you're saying it's conditioned, who's giving you the instructions to say what you're saying?
That's why we thought it was problematic to work with Mr. Giuliani.
Exactly. But who did you work with to say the things that you said? Did you have conversations with the Chief of Staff, with Secretary Pompeo to say what you were saying? You didn't just say this on your own.
Are you talking about in the July 10th meeting?
That's correct.
Oh, yeah, with Ambassador Volker, because at that point, Ambassador Volker was the one in touch with Mr. Giuliani, not me.
But you had no direct conversations with Mr. Mulvaney about this or Secretary Pompeo to make this condition statement?
Only the texts and emails that I've already reviewed.
Thank you. My time is up.
Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you, Ambassador Sondland, for your service. And I also want to
York.
thank you for your recognition in your opening statement of your
And
hardworking
just like to remind
staff
you
at the
that
U.S. mission
Tedra
to the
Cobb,
EU.
a Democrat from New
Mr.
York,
Sondland,
is
you
running
testified
against
that
Elise
you never
Stefanik. Her
received
website
any
is
direct
Tedra Cobb,
confirmation or specific information as
TEDRACOBB.com.
to why there was a hold on aid.
That's correct.
And in fact, you testified, quote, President Trump never told me directly that the aid was conditioned on the investigations, end quote.
That's correct.
You said, quote, never heard those words from the president, correct?
Correct.
Instead, you testified that in
She
your
also was a
September
debate
9th
prep
call with President
coach
Trump, the
for Paul
president
Ryan.
said, quote, no quid pro quo.
Stefanik.
I want nothing. I want nothing. I want President Zelensky to do the right thing.
She's good at that.
Do what he ran on, end quote. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the fact is, the aid was given to Ukraine without any announcement of new investigations.
That's correct.
And President Trump did, in fact, meet with President Zelensky in September at the United Nations, correct?
He did.
And there was no announcement of investigations before this meeting?
Correct.
And there was no announcement of investigations after this meeting?
That's right.
And you've been very clear when Chairman Schiff has asked you broadly about investigations. You've corrected that to say specifically your understanding of investigations are investigation into the 2016 elections and investigations into Burisma. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And are you aware that during the Obama administration, the U.S. partnered with the UK and Ukraine on an investigation into the owner of Burisma as part of Ukraine's anti-corruption efforts?
I became aware of it today during the hearing.
Other witnesses have testified, but yes. And in fact, the Obama administration State Department was concerned about the potential appearance of conflict of interest with Hunter Biden serving on the board of Burisma because they raised this as they were preparing Ambassador Yovanovitch for her Senate confirmation. Are you aware of that?
I'm not aware of it.
She testified, when I asked her that question, both in the open hearing and the closed deposition. And I've asked most of our witnesses this, and every witness I've asked has said yes, and I want to ask you this today. Do you believe that Hunter Biden having a position on the board of Burisma has the potential appearance of a conflict of interest?
I don't want to characterize Hunter Biden's service on the board one way or another. I just don't know enough.
So you disagree with every other witness that has answered yes, there is a potential appearance of a conflict of interest?
Well, you asked if there was a conflict or an appearance of
potential, my quote was, the potential appearance of a conflict of interest.
I didn't hear the word appearance. Well, clearly it's an appearance of a conflict.
Correct. Clearly, it is an appearance of conflict of interest. Again, this is something that every witness has answered yes to or agreed with. It could have a potential appearance, and yet we are not allowed to call Hunter Biden to answer questions in front of this committee.
Oh, poor
Thank you
Republican
again for your
snowflakes.
truthful testimony today, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Mr. Swalwell.
Ambassador Sondland,
Eric Swalwell of
you were
California.
told by the
This is gonna be
president
good.
and others to not show up. You showed up. I think that says a lot about you, and I think history will look kindly on you doing that. But there are consequences to that, and just a couple hours ago, President Trump was asked about you, and he said, "I don't know him well. I have not spoken to him much. This is not a man I know well." Is that true?
It really depends on what you mean by know well. We are not close friends. No, we have a professional, cordial working relationship.
And in that working relationship, he knows who you are?
Yes.
And he has spoken to you often?
What's often?
Well, you said at least 20 times.
Okay, if that's often, then it's often.
And you donated $1 million to his inaugural committee, is that right?
I bought a VVIP ticket to the inauguration.
That's a lot of money, isn't it?
It's a lot of money.
And after that, the president makes you ambassador to the European Union. Eventually, the ambassador to Ukraine is removed. And as you told us in your deposition, you become a central figure as it relates to Ukraine. That's a pretty big responsibility, right?
Well, I don't know that I said I was a central figure. I was one of several people who were tasked to work on the Ukraine file.
And would you ever, in that big responsibility, take any actions that were not authorized by President Trump?
Well, by President Trump or the leadership in the State Department.
Were you ever hauled into the leadership of the State Department for any actions you had taken around your work on Ukraine?
No.
As to Rudy Giuliani, on May 23rd, the president told you, talk to Rudy. You talked to him a couple times. You, as you told us in September, talked to the president a couple times. Did the president ever say to you, stop talking to Rudy?
No.
Did he ever say, don't any longer talk to Rudy?
No.
On Ukraine, you said that you were playing the hand you were dealt. President Trump was the dealer, wasn't he?
President Trump was what?
The dealer. In your metaphor, you were playing the hand you were dealt. The dealer is President Trump. Is that right?
I'll recharacterize your question by saying we followed the direction of the president because that was the only pathway to working with Ukraine.
On page 4 of your testimony, you said, given what we knew at the time, what we were asked to do did not appear to be wrong. And you would agree now, Ambassador, knowing what you know now, what you did not know at the time, there are some things around Ukraine that were wrong.
I agree.
So let's take out any leveraging of security assistance over the Ukrainians and a White House visit. Would you agree that it is wrong for the President of the United States to ask the leader of a foreign government to investigate the President of the United States' political opponent?
Yes.
Would you agree that in addition to making that request for an investigation, leveraging a visit at the White House that a foreign government leader desperately needs is also wrong?
Leveraging in what respect?
A meeting at the White House. If someone really needs a meeting at the White House to show their legitimacy to their people, that leveraging that meeting and asking for an investigation would be wrong.
Well, to be candid, Congressman, every meeting at the White House has conditions placed on it. I've never worked on a meeting at the White House that doesn't have a host of conditions placed.
But if one of those conditions is to investigate a political opponent, you would agree that would be wrong?
The political opponent, yes, but making announcements or investigations per se, no.
And if you asked a foreign government leader to investigate your political opponent, leveraged a White House meeting, and leveraged security assistance, in this hypothetical, you would agree all three of those are wrong?
In the hypothetical, yes, I would agree.
Now, you, before becoming an ambassador, worked as a businessman, and I presume you worked on a lot of deals, is that right?
Correct.
Involving millions of dollars?
Correct.
You work for a guy now who wrote a book called Art of the Deal, is that right?
I do.
And State Department employees have told us that they don't want to make legal definitions around what occurred with the White House meeting being leveraged against the investigations, but you plainly call it a quid pro quo. Is that right?
I did.
And finally, one final hypothetical. If someone walks through those two doors wearing rain boots, a raincoat, and holding an umbrella with raindrops falling off of them, do you have to see outside that it's raining to presume or conclude that it might be raining outside?
I understand your hypothetical.
I yield back.
Thank you.
Ms. Hurd.
That was a good one from Swalwell. Yeah, he's basically trying to argue that this guy's conclusions are not at all unreasonable. And, it's now being tossed off to a Republican for questioning. This is Will Hurd of Texas.
I'm having a very hard time hearing you, sir.
Who's very soft-spoken. So anyhow, we'll be back with the ongoing explosive testimony of Ambassador Gordon Sondland
committee in order to
before the U.S. House of Representatives Intelligence Committee, now operating as the Impeachment Inquiry.
Did you participate in or overhear any conversations
to
about
Thom
the potential
Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archive.
And Hurd is again trying to get him to say, "Oh yeah, I heard the president." No, I didn't hear the president say. We're back to Michael Cohen stuff. We'll be back.
Being discussed.
Not that I recall.
In your statement on page 5, you said Mr. Giuliani's requests were a quid pro quo for arranging a White House visit for President Zelensky. Then you also recounted your conversation with President Trump where he says, "I want nothing, no quid pro quo." How do you reconcile these two statements?
They're hard to reconcile. We were working along Mr. Giuliani's direction for a period of time. We still didn't have a White House meeting. Aid was now held up. There were lots of reasons being given by various people as to why those weren't moving forward. And I finally got exasperated by receiving Ambassador Taylor's latest text, and I just picked up the phone. I got through the president, and I said, "What do you want?"
Sure. Are you aware of any specific conversations Mayor Giuliani had with the president between your May 23rd conversation and September 11th, 2019?
I don't recall if Mayor Giuliani, when I was directly talking to him, either through a conference call or on a direct call, whether he quoted from the president or said, "I just talked to the president." Most of the communications, as I said, went through Ambassador Volker initially. So I don't want to opine on what may or may not have been said.
On page 11 of your testimony, you said Mr. Giuliani had been communicating with Ukrainians without our knowledge. I'm assuming you're believing you Mr. Volker, and Ambassador Taylor. Which Ukrainians was Rudy Giuliani communicating with?
Well, I was specifically referring to this text that I received from Ambassador Volker, where Mr. Giuliani was apparently telling the Ukrainians something that frustrated Ambassador Volker.
Sure. So who specifically? Right. We know that
Mr. Lutsenko, the old prosecutor.
And do you think Mr. Lutsenko has any gravitas within the Zelensky regime?
I don't know. He was the old attorney general and
ultimately got fired in August when the new group came in. Okay, so we know Rudy Giuliani has met with Mr. Yermak on the fringes of meetings in, I think it was Spain. Do you know any other Ukrainian official within the Zelensky regime that Mayor Giuliani was meeting with?
I don't know who Mr. Giuliani was meeting with.
Had you had any conversations with Ukrainian officials within the Zelensky regime that came to you and said, "Hey, I just got off the phone with Giuliani. What the hell is he talking about?"
I don't recall.
Would that be normal? In all your interactions with ambassadors and heads of states and governments, if there is some element of the U.S. government that they have spoken to, isn't it usually the step that they come in, talk to the ambassador, try to clarify what that statement was? Is that a true characterization of how elements of diplomacy work?
I think that's a reasonable possibility. Things work all kinds of different ways these days.
When you met with President Zelensky after the July 25th phone call, so you met him on July 26th, did the investigations or Joe Biden come up in that meeting?
I don't recall Joe Biden coming up.
Was there any frustration expressed to you by the phone call that happened the day before?
No, as I testified, everyone said it was a good call.
Is, in your opinion, your interactions with President Zelensky, is he a straight shooter? Is he a liar? Or is he a liar?
He impressed me greatly, and that's why I wanted to get he and President Trump together as soon as possible.
And so when he makes express statements, you tend to believe them?
Yeah, with my limited interaction with him, he seems very honorable.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I hope you make it plain.
Thank you, Mr. Hurd.
I yield back.
Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, Ambassador. Welcome. Others close to President Trump have made it clear that investigations were in fact part of the conditions for U.S. assistance to Ukraine, including Rudy Giuliani and Mick Mulvaney,
So nuclear
the
power is
acting
being
chief of
sold
staff.
as the thing that's going to
Ambassador
save us from
Sondland,
climate change.
at a press conference on October 17th, acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney discussed his belief that it's entirely appropriate to politicize U.S. foreign policy. Ambassador, how often did you speak or meet with Mr. Mulvaney?
Again, based on my lack of records, I'm going by a bad memory.
Just based on your memory.
I only think I had one formal meeting with Mr. Mulvaney, and it had nothing to do with Ukraine. It had to do with a completely unrelated matter.
So did you have a chance to talk with Ms. Mulvaney about your efforts in the Ukraine?
I think most of our communication were through the stream of emails, which others were on generally. And I may have seen him at the White House casually and said hello and, kept in touch, but we didn't have a back and forth.
Well, let me ask you this. Was it your sense that Mr. Mulvaney had a direct line to President Trump? He must have as acting chief of staff, is that right?
Of course.
This is
Let us
Joaquin
look at what
Castro
Mr.
of
Mulvaney
Texas,
said during his
interviewing
October
Mr.
17th
Sondland.
press conference.
Those were the driving factors. Did he also mention to me in the past the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely, no question about that. But that's it, and that's why we held up the money. Now, there was a report.
So the demand for an investigation into the Democrats was part of the reason that he ordered to withhold funding to Ukraine.
The look back to what happened in 2016 certainly was part of the thing that he was worried about in corruption with that nation. And that is absolutely appropriate.
He said that President Trump, in that clip, had an interest in the investigations, did he not?
Apparently, yes.
He's the chief of staff. He's somebody that
of,
sees the president and has conversation with the president
staff,
every
Mulvaney.
single day. Wouldn't you expect that?
Just described as a quid pro quo.
I would expect he has a direct line to the president.
Ambassador Sondland, when did you first learn from Mr. Mulvaney that the investigations were holding up the security assistance, if at any time?
I don't know that I heard it from Mr. Mulvaney.
Okay. And
You're right.
Ambassador Sondland, I know that you're not a career Foreign Service officer. Is it your understanding that the U.S. government conditions security assistance on an investigation into a political rival all the time?
I've already testified I didn't think that would be proper.
All right. Well, let us also see what Mr. Mulvaney had to say about that at the same press conference.
Those were the driving factors. Did he also mention to me in the past the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely, no question about that. But that's it, and that's why we held up the money. Now, there was a report.
I'll just go ahead and read it for you because this thing.
Mick Mulvaney clip. It's fascinating, for Sondland.
I'll read it.
Where Mulvaney is basically saying,
He says,
yeah,
and
of
I
course we
have news for
Here it
everybody.
is. Castro's going to read
Get
it.
over it. There's going to be political influence in foreign policy. Knowing what you know now about what was intended with Ukraine, do you agree with Mr. Mulvaney that there's just going to be political influence in foreign policy, or that we should all just get over it and allow a president now or later to investigate a political rival and ask a foreign government to do that? Do you agree with Mr. Mulvaney?
I think there's a big difference between political influence and investigating a rival, because politics enters into everything relating to foreign policy.
So, but you disagree that you agree that the president should not be allowed to ask for the investigation of a political rival?
In the context of what was going on in Ukraine, I believe that the president should not investigate a political rival in return for a quid pro quo.
And part of the way that you figured out that all of this stuff that was going on, that you were part of something that was basically wrong, is because in the July 25th phone call, the president himself, he didn't tell you, we don't know if he told Rudy Giuliani or not, because Rudy Giuliani won't come in here. He said directly to the president of Ukraine that he wanted the Bidens investigated. Wasn't that your reading of the call?
First of all, I don't believe that I was a part of something that was wrong, because based on what I knew, I thought we were operating well within the center lane of proper U.S. diplomacy.
I yield back.
Mr. Ratcliffe.
Ratcliffe
Chairman,
is the
thank you.
Republican.
Ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a statement issued this morning from the Office of the Vice President by Chief of Staff Mark Short.
Without objection.
Ambassador Sondland, I'll be brief. In
From Texas.
anticipation of Mr. Holmes's testimony tomorrow about this July 26 phone call that he overheard at a cafe in Kiev that you had with President Trump, he overheard that even though the call was not on speakerphone, correct?
I don't believe so.
All right. Was it an open air cafe?
It was outdoors.
One of the points that my Democratic colleagues keep making is that David Holmes's prior testimony, which he'll apparently confirm tomorrow, is that President Trump said that he doesn't give a blank about Ukraine. You heard that earlier?
That was not on the phone call. I don't think he testified that was on the phone call. I think he was testifying that I summarized the phone call, and I don't recall saying that.
And you have no recollection of that?
I don't.
Yeah. Even if it was true, there's nothing wrong with that, to have an opinion about.
He can have whatever opinion he wants about Ukraine.
It's all part of the narrative that President Trump is a bad guy, that he doesn't care about the Ukrainians. But it seems to me, Ambassador Sondland, that nothing says you care more about the Ukrainians than sending Javelin anti-tank missiles. Do you agree with me?
I agree that sending Javelin anti-tank missiles is something the Ukraine wanted and needed.
Certainly, those work a lot better in stopping Russian tanks than the blankets that were sent by the Obama administration.
Your point is taken.
I'll yield back.
Thank you.
Mr. Heck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ambassador, thank you for your stamina, sir.
This is Denny Hecht of Washington. Apparently, Sondland.
You would agree, would you not, sir, that foreign interference
trying to get a
in our
plane out of Washington,
is or can
D.C.
be a
this
threat to our
afternoon. I think the
democracy?
last nonstop is out of
Under
Dulles
certain conditions,
at
yes.
5:30, as I recall. I used to take that plane a lot.
Everybody has a friend, a family member, or neighbor who's a nurse. Certainly, it's a profession that every one of us encounters during our lifetime, some more than others, unfortunately. But we all interact with nurses many times throughout our lives.
Bye.